So I want to welcome all of you. My name is Susan Igris. I'm with the Institute for Reproductive Health and have been involved in the passages and the TJ project that we're going to be talking about, and serving as your moderator just for the first part of this meeting. To open, though, I wanted to start off with some words from Mihira Kara, Dr. Kara, and then from our keynote speaker, Antje Becker-Benton. And Mihira, if you want to come up, you can speak. But Mihira, I think all of you know, she's the chief of the Research Technology Utilization Division of the Office of Population. And her vision, I think, has really allowed us to have the kinds of projects that we're sharing with you today and going into passages. And I just wanted to thank you for that, because I think the kinds of thematic areas that we're dealing with in applied research to interventions are really critical for the future. So thank you. Let me give you that.
Thank you, Susan. Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you all. And thanks especially to the partners who implemented these two fantastic programs. Pathfinder, SAVE, CARE, PLAN. Who else am I missing? I think that was it, if I remember the two projects right. And thanks to all the partners from Uganda and Benin who are here. Thank you so much for traveling all this way to share your wonderful words of wisdom with us. And it's wonderful to look back and realize we are here after 6 years. And I also want to say that you had a lot of support from not just me or my division. We had a lot of people at AID who have been watching these two projects and been waiting for the results to move ahead with the learnings. We've had the gender team at USAID in the Office of Population who have been extremely supportive. My old boss, Sarah Harbison, helped me design this program. She's retired, but she keeps asking me about them. And Linda Sussman, who's unfortunately in India right now, who actually took over both the projects and the Passages project, which was designed based on these two projects, has missed both your end of project meetings. That's too bad, but I'm glad I'm here. I haven't been closely in touch with the projects in the last couple of years, but I've been trying to attend and keep up to date. The projects were designed, as you all know, as truly experiments. We intuitively know that normative change is critical for a lot of behaviors, and that social change is necessary for a lot of those behaviors to change. But people keep asking us for empirical evidence to link the chain, to show the causality between the changes in norms to the ultimate behaviors that we are interested in, some of which are use of family planning if they are old enough, adolescents, and decreasing gender-based violence, those kinds of behaviors, which we all know intuitively are rooted in all these normative and social changes. However, to show that link and to show the impact is very difficult. And that's what both these projects attempted to do. And so they were designed as small, very focused programs in one site each only. But the whole idea was to try and develop in an iterative process the kinds of interventions that could be taken to scale. That's a critical factor. There are a lot of things that work, but are so intensive and labor intensive and cost intensive that they never get taken to scale. So you can't show impact at a population level. So that was one of the major premises, that whatever they design needs to be taken to be able to be taken to scale. So that's what this whole program was about. Iterative design, good, solid research design to be able to show impact, and then using the last year and a half to try to build the partnerships to start using the findings, not only in the sites where they were first implemented, with Uganda and Benin, but elsewhere. And to a large extent, both projects succeeded. There are always hiccups, and those will be described, but these set the stage. Both these projects have set the stage for a lot of future work, not only with aid funding, but with other donor funding. The Passages project, which kind of picks up from here, has been trying to not only replicate, but adapt the work from GREAT and from TJ in DRC, and hopefully in other places. But a lot depends on money, but there are other donors who have been brought to the table thanks to all of your work. And thanks to Linda Sussman and Caitlin and others in the office who have been kind of beating the bushes to get the support. So with that, I think I will stop and say this is just the beginning. Okay, the 2 projects may have ended, but this is the beginning of an extremely important endeavor that is usually always most difficult to do and most difficult to find funding for, but more and more donors and others in country are beginning to realize, thanks to your work, that these are critical areas and need continued support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahira. When we were trying to identify who was going to be our keynote speaker, we started asking different people who they thought would be really interesting, who could help situate the S in the SBC, who understood it from a real ground field implementation level. So we had some names, and Antje came up, and I remember one of the people we were reaching out to was saying, yes, she has a real passion and understanding for the S part of SBC. So she would be a really ideal person to kind of bring us through and help us situate more clearly, because there's a lot of ambiguity how S and BC all fit together. Help us think through some of the ideas and the concepts and make some of these things that will help us, if we are better at distinguishing where we are and where we're going, will help us go better. So I wanted to invite Antje Becker-Benton up to give us her keynote address. I think you're going to be at the podium. Yeah. So Antje has a really interesting history, starting outside of health and working her way into health. And she's going to talk a little bit about her journey, so I'm not going to talk too much, but she's currently she is the Behavior Change and Community Health Team Leader and Senior Technical Advisor for Save the Children US. And I don't think I need to say much more. I mean, SAVE, as you know, is involved in a lot in this, trying to push this effort forward within its own programming. But she has decades of experience and really is looking at the application of SBCC and demand creation in education, reproductive health, climate change, wildlife and conservation, urban development, violent extremism, and other areas that overlap with health and behavior. So I'd like to introduce you to start your speech. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. Let me see how I navigate this one. There's something blocked here. It's fine. I think I have to go this way.
It might just be a little slow.
Okay, now we go. All right, so this is just another title slide about the S and SBC, which is what I'm talking about, and situating the S for the later presentations that you will give. And there will be actually the actual meat of today. I think I'm here and I've been chosen for this keynote because I almost have a personal journey with that S and SBCC. Which is why I feel honored to be able to enrich your lunch break. I think you're almost done for this important event. And so let me tell you a bit more about this journey with the S in hopes that it will help frame the further presentations on Tékponon, Jikuagou, and the Great Project. And when I was thinking about the S and thinking about what I would say, I visualized things. And I was thinking of, you know, remember this little paperclip of the old Microsoft Word versions, you know, the one blink, blink, trying to be helpful and somewhat resilient, I guess, you know, and I thought like, oh, that looks like an S. And I think we people of a certain age may remember this guy as being pretty obnoxious and not all helpful at all times. You're nodding, good, so we're in sync with that. So let's get started with the journey. It actually had 6 stages. So I'll run you through 6 stages of this journey with the S, which is beginning with the S in sociology, actually in political science for political sociology. In Berlin, I was told that every story has a place. So I'm going to tell you where all of this happened. The second stage was my experience in studying health communication, health promotion in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and the dominance of psychosocial and individual change models at the time, 1990s. Then we'll go to community work on Indian reservations in the Southwest, South African Community Radio, and a short stint in Sierra Leone post-war, where I was busy with the question, why can't health communication address social context a little better? And then came Sea Change, just at the right time. There was things in between, but Sea Change was basically the fulcrum of all these lessons learned, where we actually added the S to SPCC, social and behavior change communication is what that stands for, with the hope that we could focus more on context and on knowledge than on knowledge and attitudes, which were quite dominant at the time. So in the current stage, I'm almost closing the circle because I joined Save the Children a year ago, where I'm currently looking at social and behavior change with a community lens and with a community health lens and a health systems lens at times. And so what finalizes that journey is looking at what does that all mean, all this experience with the S and SBC for the new partners that are coming into the field, namely behavioral economics, human-centered design, habit formation. Are they looking at the S, large S, small s, what's it gonna be? So let's start off my journey. I'm from Berlin. What you see there is Berlin day and night. We're very proud of that fact. So I used to be a political scientist, and I first studied and then I actually taught political sociology, and that's the study of social relationships. So here is the S. And institutions and sometimes of social movements, what makes them tick, how do they work, how do they function. I learned a lot also about the divisions of class, gender, and ethnicity, and how these can overlap and affect access to services, social stability in whole societies, but also sometimes radical change. So that's what I was studying. And I was studying a lot about the concepts that we're dealing with now, which are social norm change, normative change, and social change, and that there are some differences between them. And I hope that helps for later discussions. I called this slide Size Matters because we're dealing with these terms and let's say at different scales. So we're starting up with social norms. They're constructs, collectively shared beliefs about what is typical for us in our society, in our groups, and what is appropriate to do. And we maintain these social norms by approving or disapproving actions of others. For example, the willingness to share an opinion depends on the perception of public opinion on the subject. And those are perceived norms. So those are individually held, perceived norms, whereas what is appropriate or what is typical are kind of, is engaging us in social relationships. What do we expect from each other? So there's a social and there's an individual. But it's still rather small compared to normative change, because when that happens, it affects a segment of society. Normative change is slightly larger. And it's seen normative change interventions, which is something you will be looking at later on, are catalysts for communities to challenge existing social norms that support individual attitudes and behaviors that can lead to poor health. So that's how Passages, the Passages Project is defining it. So slightly larger, this is a chunk of society. Now, social change is usually considered change adopted by whole society. For example, protection of workers, or the 35-hour week, which is now a 38-hour week, or maybe even larger, which needs a lot of agreement and consensus and negotiation for several sectors. UNICEF would even go so far to say that the unit of change is our society groups, and that distributing power within social and political institutions are actually part of social. We're talking about. Now, meanwhile, the next step in my journey with the S is when I started another master's degree in health communication in Baltimore. Sorry, Antje, your mic is out. Can you hear me, or is there a problem? Yeah. Louder? Oh, I see. Okay, can you give that a try? How's that? Still hear me? Okay, good. So next step in the journey, I'm in Baltimore. I'm studying health communication at Hopkins. And I had actually graduated political science with a thesis comparing how European governments had dealt with HIV epidemics in the 80s, when they were trying to reach very hard to reach segments of society. And there was a lot of large S issues. There were lots of social norms because I was working with sex workers, with drug users, with men having sex with men. And there was a large S that was winding itself around stigmatization. And so when I came to Baltimore, I was dealing with a little bit of a surprise about the dominance of psychosocial and individual change models when I was studying. I have to say, to give it justice, that there were other models as well that were studied at the time, no doubt about it. But you know, the practitioners around me were really kind of being very close to the individual level models because I think they were easier. They were not as complex to deal with. And they had also shown some successes in the US, maybe not in developing countries. So while there was already an understanding that we should not blame the victim in health education, health promotion, that you can't empower other people, they can only empower themselves, we still went ahead and applied the health belief model and the stages of change to sub-Saharan Africa. And we were asking women to carry condoms, even though, and mind you, this is the 90s, even though that was against their social norms. And oftentimes it ended up raising fear of violent consequences, and there was widespread intimate partner violence, and we didn't really look at that. And so the failure of these approaches could have been easily explained, I think, with more social norm knowledge at the time, because evidence suggests that when norms are at play, shifting knowledge or individual attitudes is often not enough to shift behaviors. So this is something we need to look at. The reason is that people rather conform to group expectations out of a very simple human need, which is the one for approval, for social approval. There's the S again, and belonging. And in some societies, this need is a lot stronger than in others, and so are the consequences of violating these expectations. People are ostracized, gossiped about, or worse, physically harmed or even killed when they are departing from those norms. And I just read today that there was an honor killing in my hometown in Berlin where 2 Turkish brothers killed their sister because she had violated such norms. And that just recently happened. So we have to take these things, I think, a lot more serious than we did at the time. Meanwhile, after learning all of that, I was ready to do more community work. And I just give you a couple of examples here. I was working in the US with American Indian reservations, with the White Mountain Apaches, with the Navajo and the Gila River community. I was working with Bush Radio in South Africa, and I had a short stint in Sierra Leone after the war. And all of those left me with the question, why can't health communication address social context a little better? When I worked on the Indian reservation it was actually a youth talk show on the radio, quite fun. It showed me that Western notions of individualism and competition were actually clashing with social norms over there, and also with tribal code. And one example of that is when youth were trying to go to off-reservation schools or colleges that not only their peers were trying to hold them back, but also their family members and their parents, in the fear that they wouldn't be able to survive off-reservation. So these were very strong norms of, you know, you need to stay with us, you know, only with us can you survive. In South Africa, that was in 2000, I joined Bush Radio, which was doing at the time what Susan Leclerc-Madlala at USAID, I hope you know her, has been asking for, namely to bridge the gulf between how HIV was understood by the medical profession and how everybody else understood HIV at the time, namely as a social change disease, you know, namely one of failing social networks and failing values and failing institutions. So there was also a gulf that we, you know, navigated quite late in the game. And an example of that is that clearly treatment access in South Africa, if you remember, dependent on a range of social, cultural, and a lot of political factors. And in the end, if you think about it, that's true for the success of any prevention techniques, such as testing or even adherence to medication. You need support. And so to speak with Susan Kippax, I'm not sure if you encountered her. She works in Australia at University of Australia, of Sydney, University of Sydney. she stated that public health needs to address people not only as individuals, but as connected members of groups, networks, and collectives, because they interact with each other, they have sex with each other, they negotiate. And the person I was working with at Bush Radio, I want to name her by name because she was incredibly courageous. She did just that. She created networks among positive people at a time where there was no access to treatment whatsoever. And that was very courageous at the time. So now comes the last epiphany, and that was in Sierra Leone. And I was sent to develop a HIV prevention strategy for youth. And I was with a lot of people, youth and adults, and I was doing barrier analysis, and I was asking them, okay, what are the biggest barriers to prevention behaviors? And they answered in unison, poverty. And mind you, this is post-war Sierra Leone and Freetown. They had just crawled out of, their ruins in their Sunday bests, which they ironed with irons that used coal because there was no electricity. And so my answer, when it came to that question, what we could do is that health communication couldn't address poverty. We could only work on attitudes and knowledge and behaviors. And at that moment, looking at that group and knowing where they came from, I just intuitively knew that that was a wrong answer and that I wasn't willing to say that again in any workshop. And that health communication had to have more in its toolbox than knowledge, attitudes, and practices. So rich field experience, and what did that end up to be? It came to the S and C change. You remember Communication for Change? That was the predecessor of HC3 that is now with Hopkins. At the time it was first with AED and then with FHI 360. And we had the great chance to add the S, the social, to BCC, behavior change communication at the time. I had joined Neil McKee in the Sea Change team at the right time to be able to work on this area. And Neil had come from UNICEF's C4D, so Communication for Development, which is a different strand almost of communication work, before joining CCP. And so when we met at AED, we both were interested to show a more visible focus on context, on social norms, and on actually sustainable change. And why was that? Because actually that project had a mandate to go beyond health. And when you are beyond health and you're dealing with education or with wildlife protection or other things, structural and economic barriers and all kinds of other barriers are a lot stronger, or at least are considered to be stronger. And so that may explain why we were so keen on adding the S, but not enough with that. There were a lot of practitioners that agreed with us at the time that BCC efforts had only focused so long on individual behavior change because they were using theories developed in the West that were focusing on individual behavior change, and that we needed to make a difference there. Full well knowing that social relationships depend on larger systems. As you can see, here are the rings of influence. You may be familiar with this one. That was the framework we were using at the time. So I think there was overall consensus. We basically fed with this onto a growing understanding that adding this S to SPCC would help the field recognize that systematic socio-ecological thinking was needed to show more influence on individual behaviors and how we could address that better. So we just were standing basically together with all the colleagues in the other organizations. And one of them is Manoff. I kind of years later looked at their website, and they had basically summarized what we were doing there in a much better way than we did actually. And so what they said was that social change approaches tend to focus on community as the unit of change. Very true. And unlike other terms, SBCC explicitly includes social change perspectives that foster processes of community dialogue and action. So that was, also the meaning of the S, to focus more on what happens at community level as the social and SBCC. Now, I think I can say that this approach has been more accepted after Sea Change. Maybe not widely enough yet, but I think a bit more. And that several programs have demonstrated actually that this is an important shift. And I'm only mentioning here fairly quickly CCP's Chova Chova in Mozambique, because that's well documented and managed with a community dialogue program to produce changes in gender attitudes, gender roles, and HIV stigma, while doing the usual increase in knowledge and basically, I think it was couple dialogue. Most recently, Save the Children has evaluated a very short campaign actually in Malawi under the Gates-funded SNL program, Saving Newborn Lives. And that managed to improve social norms about small preterm babies because they were considered more to be little cats actually than human beings, and increased social support for kangaroo mother care. So, but you will hear, today a lot more about, how to go about programming on social norms and measurements and results right after this speech. So I'll keep this short. I just wanted to mention that Rajiv Rimal and Adrian Chung are on the way to figure out the relationship between social norms and behaviors and how that works a lot better. Also, I think even in collaboration with Passage's project. So we still have a lot of questions how that works. Even if we improve social norms, what does that mean for household behaviors? So that means we made things a lot more complex. Sometimes behaviors are held in place by a matrix of interlocking norms. We all know that. And you can't just come in with knowledge and attitudes. But sometimes practices can be driven by material factors. For example, when early marriage is driven by wanting to feed one less mouth in the family. And then social norms programming may not be as effective as looking at more economical issues around it. Or early marriage can also be motivated by fear that unmarried girls become sexually active and bring shame to the family. So then we're back at norms, and should address it differently. And so that all means that SBC is highly complex, social and behavior change, and that understanding the drivers of certain behaviors and norms is needed before making decisions on the large S in strategy. So do you need a minute to digest that? I can help you with that. So now we're almost done with the journey. We're at step 5. I'm now at Save the Children for a year and working on SBC with a community health lens. And what that means is that I'm looking at more behavioral thinking in community capacity strengthening. What are we trying to push when we build capacity, and more collective action in the social and behavior change thinking, for example, in nutrition. Could there be more community involvement and more systematic community involvement? I'm coming almost full circle here because I can now look at both, at community health and at SBC or SBCC, at both of them. And you'll see that here we developed a bit of a framework actually to integrate our perspectives on community capacity strengthening, community mobilization, which often goes beyond behaviors, and that of social and behavior change. And we got it all, the SBC, the SBCC, and the CCS, it's all in there. So we'll hope to be a bit more visible with that in the future. Just know that, what moves us as all of you is basically what effects does community capacity strengthening have on household behaviors is a really important question. And we hope we go in that direction in the discussion. So last step, the new partners and their orientation. We have new partners in the field of SBC, from behavioral economics, from habit formation, from human-centered design. And I'm quite curious to see, if their approaches are emphasizing more the individual level once again, or if they can be useful also for normative change and maybe even policy change. So let's look at behavioral economics. They want to challenge, and this is the British definition, by the way, slightly different. They want to challenge the traditional view that behavior change should be achieved by informing, convincing, incentivizing, or penalizing people. And they'd rather look at human decisions which are strongly influenced by context and in the way choices are presented. Remember, choice architecture is one of their terms. Opting in, opting out versions and so forth. So, I could say then the context is basically part of their thinking, but again, is it for individual choice, which doesn't ladder up to normative choice? Or, I think in this British stream, I think they're talking also about using behavioral economics for policy change. So this is something we need to keep an eye on. Similarly, human-centered design makes it its business to design according to clients' needs and get feedback throughout product development and prototyping and feedback. But they don't, as far as I can see, use participatory methods, which sometimes then come with collective action or collective voice back to them to do certain changes. And I hope that in the future, we can combine our approaches, we can combine what we know works, but also keep questioning our assumptions about each other. So, summary, we're at the end of the journey. What happened? Study of social and political relationships and stigma in Berlin, and the clarity that normative change is not just yet social change. Difference. Study of health communication in Baltimore. A lot of individual level theories underestimating stronger needs for social approval or consequences of not conforming to group expectations. Work at community level in South Africa and Sierra Leone, and really wanting health communication to be more than KAP or even KAPB, which I think we did with adding the S under sea change to SBCC, but also made, I think, ecological thinking more popular, but we also added a lot more complexity. There's gender and power and culture and community and organization and political and economic influences, and how do you actually choose between all of them? What's the driver? And now, Save the Children in US, community dialogue and action with a stronger measurement, hopefully soon, of household level behavioral effects. And a keen eye on improvements in individual behavior change, or a keen eye on neurological research and habit formation and behavioral economics, with the hope that they're not getting stuck with individual level behavior change only, although that's very important. So what does it all amount to? The journey and the paperclip and all of that. I think in summary, we can say that the S in social and behavior change is a lot more accepted. There are a lot more proposals coming out of user aid that are asking for social norm change, and also other donors that are quite interested in it. There were a lot of disciplines involved in this, not only psychology, not only what public health emphasizes, but also social sciences are coming to the fore. And I think we're getting better in addressing and measuring social norms or normative change, but that's up to you to decide after we get the next presentation. So what we're not doing yet with the S in SBCC is using it for lasting social change, because that's a lot larger and needs more effort, more concerted effort. So I'm wondering, why are we not using more social mobilization lately that basically mobilizes other sectors around, issues of health? Why are we not supporting social movements yet systematically? And couldn't there be some more learning or lending a hand to systematic advocacy, making that more behavioral, but also learning how they actually move things forward? So could that be the next step in the journey, mine and yours and ours together? And could we maybe even address issues of social equality, civil rights, gender-based violence, institutionalized racism, or hate crimes against people of color? Could we use SBC for that as well? And maybe that's what's needed at the moment. The S and SBCC could play a key role. And with that, thank you very much.
That was lovely, and I appreciated the collective journey that we're all on, as well as your really great insights. So I think what we're going to do is just take 3 questions, because a lot of the discussion and issues that Antje is raising, we'll be able to talk about more this afternoon. But so we wanted to take 3 questions just for clarification from the audience, if there are any. Yes, go ahead.
You talked a little bit about radio, but my question to you is, do you think that it's necessary to use mass media to conduct successful social norms intervention?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, do we need social media? Do we need radio in order to do social norm change, or can it only be done at community is the question. Well, great question, hard to answer. I think, social norm change, looking at normative change, we want to have more scale, more coverage. And sometimes social media can emphasize and amplify what's happening at community level a lot better than communities can themselves. So why not take mass media at its strength to possibly focus more on what happens at community level, to bring that back to the urban centers, to increase communication, to increase, because collective norms are measured by what media are saying about a society. So I think it's important to combine the two in a very strategic way and then have more effect. Anybody else?
Thank you for that excellent presentation and thought-provoking and clarifying. Okay, so now now that we've set the stage, we're sort of moving more into thinking and talking and sharing some of the learning that we got from the Tékponon Jikuagou project, and great. But before I do that, there's just a little housekeeping, not even housekeeping, but just to let you be aware of some announcements. So we have people who are with us, who are not with us, people in our Zoom room. And we just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for coming. We actually put in your folders a list of the people who registered, so you have a sense of who is in that larger virtual as well as present-day audience. The other thing is you're going to find in your folders too some roundtable discussion questions. And so these are areas that we really think will be interesting to explore as groups. It's not so much show and tell, but just sharing reflection and experiences. And so we want you to look at them before the break or during the break, because after the break, we're just going to move into them and you get to choose which one is the topic area that you're most interested in discussing. Also in your folder, after our session closed, we're inviting you to a reception that is just like a half a block from here, and I think we can help you find your way if you don't know where Boveda is. And you also saw on your desk certain cards which are going to be used. We're really trying to manage time, so as we go through the different chapters of our story, we wanted you to not note any questions, and then we're going to collect them so that we can address the questions at the end. And I think that's it. So without further ado, as they say, I would like to invite Rebecca to start this next part of the program. Rebecca Lundgren.
Thanks, Susan. I'm also moving over to the podium so I don't have to juggle too many things at one time. Okay, so I'm thrilled to welcome you all here again. We're kind of representing our two consortia, GREAT and TJ. We're very excited to have this opportunity to share some of our lessons learned and our reflections that we've, gathered over the last, few years with these two projects. So the challenge we've set for ourselves today is to really think over our last 6.5 years of experience and cull some of those most important reflections, from our work in Benin and Uganda on the role that social factors such as gender and social networks played in behavior change, and also to talk a little bit about how research has also supported those projects and supported implementation, research and adaptive monitoring and evaluation. So in a sense, I'm also here to set the stage. And let me just see. Okay, so before we turn to the story, I have to take a moment to recognize, excuse me, everyone who worked on these two projects. So you'll see over 100 names on the slide, and that's a lot of people. And we want to take time to recognize the creativity, the commitment, the expertise, the collaboration of all of those people. And you'll see some of them are from Benin, some of them from Uganda, and many of you are here today or also in Zoom. So we just want to recognize that without all of you, the journey would have been different and our outcomes would not have been what they are today. We also want to really recognize the role of USAID Washington and the USAID missions in Uganda and in Benin for all the support they've given us over the last 6 years. Advocacy, financial support, logistical support, moral support. It's been very significant. And then also we'd like to recognize the role of Victoria Jennings, my boss, the director of the Institute, for her role in helping to shepherd all of this forward as well. So with that, I want to kind of point out that we're only going to show you a small snapshot of results today because we really want to spend some time reflecting together. But there are many resources, there are many places you can go to get more information. So this is one of them, just recently launched. So this is a multimedia blog about the GREAT project. If you run your cursor over those boxes, each one of those boxes has a different topic and you'll find some surprises there. You'll find videos, stories, downloadable program materials, songs, all kinds of things. So you can explore that to learn a little bit more about the project. Similarly, if you go to Health Compass, thanks to our colleagues there, you can find all the program materials, results, etc. for GREAT, and also for the Tékponon Jikuagou project, which I'm going to call TJ. This one isn't live yet, but it will be live in the next week, I think. So plenty of information there for all of you. So, oh, and also, yes, you have flash drives from each project, which has all of those materials. So as you'll learn today, GREAT and TJ use a lot of storytelling. We use a lot of stories in the intervention, and we also use stories to collect data, evaluate, and understand what was happening. So today we're also going to tell you a story. We're going to tell you a story about how we grappled with what Antje the challenge she put in front of us, putting the S into behavior change, throughout these two projects, and how we did that. So we're going to tell you a story in 4 chapters. The first chapter is going to be about designing the community-based social norm interventions. Our second chapter, you have to wait for it, will be a few of the key results. The third chapter will be the use of research, adaptive learning, monitoring, evaluation. And then finally, our 4th chapter will be a panel of some esteemed colleagues who will be reflecting on, and all of you who will be reflecting on what all of this means for the field and for the future going forward. So as you've gathered by now, we're talking about 2 projects here. They both ended March of this year. They were both funded by USAID, and they were implemented by consortia. IRH was the lead of both consortium. We were the monitoring and evaluation, the scale up, and the coordinating role. And then we had other partners who played all the other roles, including a lot of the visioning around the implementation. So Tékponon Jikuagou, that project was implemented in partnership with CARE and Plan International. And the goal you see there, it was to decrease unmet need for family planning by addressing social barriers to family planning use. In the scale-up phase, there were other organizations that we'll talk about a little bit. The pilot took place in Kofu, southwest Benin, where communities are primarily Aja speaking. So the GREAT project was implemented by Save the Children and Pathfinder International with local partners Straight Talk Foundation and Concerned Parents in northern Uganda. This project was initiated the same year that the ceasefire was signed in northern Uganda, and right after the internally displaced camps closed and families returned to their ancestral homes. That was the context that we were working on gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health. This project was targeted specifically at 10 to 19-year-olds. So both projects followed a very similar trajectory. They were designed with the end in mind, as Mihira said, with scale up kind of in our vision. We engaged stakeholders throughout the project, and it was a journey really from innovation to scale up and dissemination where we stand today. You can see the different phases. We have the formative research phase, that was a year in the beginning. We had a design phase, then the pilot phase, then the scale up, documentation, and dissemination phase, where we are today. So scale up isn't our focus today. We had a separate meeting on scale up of these projects in December, but I do want to say a few things to frame the picture for you. So we use the ExpandNet model as our kind of guiding theoretical frame for this work. And in both projects, those organizations that piloted the intervention later became the resource team that was responsible for training, mentoring, and supporting the scale-up phase, or the new, we call them user organizations that adopted these interventions. Both projects approach scale-up by recruiting, reaching out to new organizations, and by helping them to adopt these interventions into their regular programming. They were provided mentoring, materials, training, and in a few cases, some small funds, but really the programs were not funded as a project per se. In GREAT, we had 30+ community-based organizations that were taking on elements of GREAT, all coordinated by government structures. And in TJ, we had 4 non-health community-based organizations that took on the TJ Family Planning Social Network intervention. They were working in literacy, WASH, nutrition, and savings and loan. So that's a little bit about the scale-up piece. So all of these, all of the implementation, this whole journey was accompanied by robust multi-method research throughout. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the methods. This is the only method slide you're going to get. So you researchers out there, we're not going to dwell on this, but you do need to have I want you to have a solid understanding of where the data is coming from. So during the pilot phase in both projects, we conducted, to measure the effect of the interventions, we conducted a quasi-experimental design survey, cross-sectional survey in households with men and women, boys and girls. And in GREAT, we also had a school-based survey to get the younger children, the 10 to 14-year-olds. We also had routine monitoring and evaluation throughout the pilot and the scale-up. And both projects had a monitoring and evaluation working group that then kind of worked on those data, analyzed them, interpreted them, and shared them with the project management groups. And this was across consortium members because we had different implementing partners. We also had a midterm qualitative assessment where we understood how people were engaging with the intervention, what was working, what was not, and tweaked it in terms of moving forward. So then moving into the scale-up phase, we wanted to assess effectiveness, capacity of the new user organizations, costs, and also sustainability. So in the case of TJ in Benin, we did conduct another baseline inline survey. And in fact, the data that we're sharing with you today will be from the scale-up phase. In GREAT, we didn't do another survey due to resources, but we used LQAS methods to look at coverage because that was a big issue in GREAT, trying to increase coverage. We also did new user capacity assessments to understand whether these new user organizations could implement the interventions with fidelity to the model. And we, in the case of TJ, we also did, Marcy's here, I think. We also conducted a qualitative assessment to understand the effects of integration of this TJ family planning intervention on their ability to meet their broader development goals. We also did qualitative assessment of the scale-up phase. In TJ, we use most significant change. Those are some of the stories that we use to understand scale-up. In GREAT, we had ethnographers embedded to observe and document the scale-up phase. In TJ, we also returned to the pilot community since we had moved on to the scale to look at whether the organizations were continuing to use the interventions, the materials, and we found that they were not as at a high level, but there was still continued use of the materials, continued acceptability to discuss family planning, and continued increased use of services, mostly qualitative results. As part of the scale-up phase, although we did it earlier, we costed the pilot phase because we wanted to be able to tell people how much the interventions would cost to scale up and what types of costs would be associated with it. Finally, we also did a 2-year qualitative cohort study in both countries where we followed 4 rounds of in-depth qualitative interviews with individuals to understand how they were engaging in the intervention, but more importantly, to really understand how the social drivers were influencing change. And we'll share a little bit of those results with you. So, as consortia, we felt very strongly that given the persistent unmet need for family planning around the world, and particularly in West Africa, as well as slow progress on meeting other reproductive health goals, Even with the exciting advances that we had had with contraceptive technology and services, we were lagging behind because we weren't putting the S in SBC. So these projects were designed to do that. We felt it was really important to recognize how the social context influences the ability to get positive health outcomes. So our challenge, as you see here, was to develop and test scalable approaches to address social factors, including gender, social networks that influence behavior. So I mentioned that our first year was dedicated to formative research. In GREAT, we conducted life histories with young people, and we also did interviews with people that they considered were significant in their lives. We have ethnographers based in the districts doing that. In the case of TJ, we did very interesting both qualitative and quantitative social network research, social network mapping, to understand the role of social networks in diffusion and unmet need. So what we found from that research in both settings was that social networks matter, that it makes a difference, and that we need to address them in our programming. We also found that men and couple relationships matter. They made a difference in terms of all of the outcomes that these projects were seeking to address. And finally, we found, not surprisingly, that gender matters. So we knew that gender underlies many of the social determinants of health. So based on that understanding, we also drew 3 theoretical frameworks to our design and to our programming. So this is the first one, and Antje mentioned it. It's kind of an ecological approach, which recognizing that there's factors at all of these levels and also operating within and between these levels that influence sexual and reproductive health outcomes. So that was one theoretical lens that we put on ourselves or on our work. You see the project goals on the left. They're very aspirational, and clearly these socially complex issues could not be addressed by an intervention that only addressed one of these levels. So the second theoretical lens that we brought to our work was understanding social diffusion. So social learning and social influence principles tell us that people learn about things and they adopt them based on what they observe in their social networks, comparing behavior, talking to others. And that helps them to helps ideas to spread and to decide whether to adopt these new ideas and behaviors. So the problem is, in many of these settings we work, and many of the behaviors that we care about, sexually transmitted infections, family planning, contraceptive use, violence, these topics aren't discussed very broadly. So the idea is, how can we address that? So both projects applied social diffusion theory, working through communication for social change and social network approaches to address, to catalyze diffusion, I guess I would say, and ultimately adoption of new ideas and behaviors. So our final theoretical lens here is the social construction of gender. So both of our projects, our interventions, were based on understanding that gender is socially constructed at different formative moments of the life course. The resulting masculinities and femininities influence sexual and reproductive health in multiple and interlocking ways, which I think you'll see from some of the results we'll present today. So this slide shows one outcome from GREAT, violence, and how it manifests throughout the adolescent life course, and how obviously interventions have to be tailored to meet that life course reality. So based on these theoretical understandings, and also informed by program reviews conducted by Pathfinder and Plan, which we sought to develop interventions which applied these program mechanisms, the ones that you see on the slide, in a scalable strategy. So our review told us that these mechanisms work. They've worked in other projects. They can be effective. But we wanted to see first how you could do that in a scalable way, and also use them to really achieve, I guess, to catalyze action reflection. So sometimes more recently we've been calling that praxis. So it's basically kind of a Freirean approach to social change. So you can use radio to disseminate messages or information, but you can also use radio to catalyze reflection and discussion and action. So using these program mechanisms, but linked with action and reflection, was what we sought to do in the design of these interventions. So with that, I'm hoping I laid the foundation for what we're going to discuss today. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Danielle Grant from Plan International. and subsequently to Brad Kerner from Save the Children. And they're going to talk about the next chapter, which is about designing interventions. Yeah, so you have cards on your desk. So please, if you have questions based on anything I said or anything that Danielle and Brad say coming up, write them down and we'll be collecting them for the question and answer.
Thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca mentioned, we have chapters that we're going to be going through, which goes through the process we did on these, on the both of the interventions. And what we're going to start with is looking at some of the elements that we considered in designing community-based norms change interventions. So first, let's look at a definition that's provided here on normative change. And this is a definition that comes out of the Passages Project. As Rebecca mentioned, a lot of the elements of the normative change are software related. We're looking at reflection, catalyzing new ideas about sensitive topics such as sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, often volunteer-driven, community diffusion were important elements of any normative change. This slide represents the implementation principles of both of the interventions. And when you look at the blocks, you'll see that a number of them are found in both. There are social norms that we're addressing, social diffusion, gender synchronization, using data for design aimed for scalability. But there are two that are distinct for each one of the interventions. If you look at the top left for the green, this is the approach that we used under the GREAT, which looked at the life stage cycle. If you look at the red, this is the approach that we used for TJ, which was using social networks for addressing unmet need for men and women. Our focus were couples, married couples. For each of the interventions, we developed a package that we used as the intervention for the programs. The TJ, as you can see, had 5 components that we developed during the pilot stage and tested it as we went along and refined it as necessary. We started with engaging communities in a social mapping approach. And here we would use a simple, very participatory approach to identify networks that exist within the community. This was not to create new networks, but to really identify those social networks that have influence. The second component was developing materials that could be used by those networks. Particularly, we had catalyzers within those networks that could use materials to stimulate dialogue around family planning, and also to use as a means of stimulating dialogue outside of the network. Within each network, there were also influentials that were identified. And we encouraged those influentials to take action. Again, they made the decision, and we developed materials that we shared with them so that they could use those in their actions. Linking to family planning services was an important component. And for forging that link, we used an invitation card approach to get the communities and the family planning service providers linked up. And finally, radio was used. And radio was used again for diffusing messages. One distinction for TJ, which was different than GREAT, is we actually recorded the community dialogue sessions as the radio so that it reinforced again the diffusion and the discussions that were going on in the community. Like TJ, GREAT had an intervention package as well, keeping in mind that they took a life stage approach, looking at 4 stages of life for youth, from puberty to sexual debut to marriage to parenthood. So their package really had to focus on the different stages of that cycle. It began with community mobilization using Save the Children's community action cycle. Radio dramas were used for diffusing, again, the messages But theirs was different in that they had 52 sessions of drama that again were used for each stage of the cycle. Linking to services, and GREAT also had a toolkit and materials which again were used and tailored for each one of the 4 stages. So we're going to look at some of the learnings that came out of the program, starting with learning number 1. Normative change requires community level change, ensure the critical role of diffusion and tipping points. So when we were designing the package, we were aiming for a hypothetical tipping point of normative change. How many community members, men and women, do we need to reach to diffuse the information to bring around sustained normative change? And we didn't start with this in mind. We realized as we were going along that we really needed to reach a saturation point. So we looked within TJ, where our focus is on the village level, what were the elements that we needed what was the mathematical equation that we needed to come up with to reach 50% of diffusion. So as you see here, we came up with a number of engaging 3 to 5 groups. Again, these were the influential groups that were identified in the social mapping, plus 5 to 10 individuals. As I mentioned, one component was focusing on influentials. Combine that with the weekly radio, which was diffusing the messages, which were the discussions that were being carried out in the community, would reach the 50% tipping point that we needed for a point of change to bring around sustained behavior change. The same had to be applied, or we tried to apply for GREAT, but that was a little bit more complicated because GREAT worked at different levels. Not only were there four life groups, but they worked both at the village, at the district, at the parish. There were different components. And all of that had to be taken into account into this mathematical equation. So they came up with a solution, looking at really including members from each of those age groups, along with work at the parish level, along with the groups that were disseminating and the various groups they were working within, along with the radio sessions to come up with a 30% tipping point. Learning number 2. When designing to scale, remember to KISS. Keep it simple and scalable. As both Susan and Rebecca mentioned, we use the ExpandNet model. And from the beginning, we were thinking of the end in mind. The aim was to have something that was scalable. So from the pilot, we had, how are we going to scale this? How are we going to make this sustainable? Key to that was keeping the interventions lean. Simple concepts, easy to use, acceptable, catalyze reflective dialogue, fun and engaging. So these were the materials. This was our motto for the materials and any of the activities. They had to be simple. They had to be engaging so that the community was engaged. They had to deal with some underlying messages around gender and social norms. They had to be low cost. Again, scalability in mind, sustainability in mind. And I must say that throughout the pilot phase in particular, we were constantly reflecting on the materials. TJ, for example, we found that we had developed the story books or the story cards and found that after some of the testing that they were still too complicated, that they were still too hard to read. So we had to simplify, simplify, simplify. This gives you sort of an example of some of the materials. On the left, or both of these are actually from GREAT. On the left is a game. The material used here are rice bags. On the right is a puberty flip book Here we have two more examples. On the left is from TJ, and this is an example, and we also have some examples here of the story cards, which were used by the catalyzers within these groups to lead dialogue discussions, to lead within the networks with the hope of diffusing that beyond the network. So again, it was an approach to diffuse information from within the networks outside. And similarly on the right, this is another game board from the GREAT project. And each one of these really fostered reflection in the community and discussion. For TJ, it was obviously a met need around family planning. In addition to the lean interventions, were lean strategies. We worked with existing platforms, groups, influentials. We didn't create new networks. We didn't create new groups. We found what was existing. We had strategic targeting of change agents. We didn't hire change agents. We really used what was in the community, coached them, but kept them minimal, brought them up to the capacity where they were comfortable, and then used media to increase diffusion, the radio, and then we let it go. We also documented, and an important part from both projects is the amount of documentation. It took a lot of time and a lot of people were involved. But in the end, this is for TJ, we have how-to guides of how you can take this intervention and integrate it into another organization. So for TJ, this also was helping in picking up the guide to do it within other organizations, but also kept the fidelity of the approach. So for TJ, we have a guide, we have the materials, everything that you could possibly need to be able to take that approach into another organization, government, NGO, and similar for the GREAT. Again, it's available on a thumb drive. I think it's also being distributed. Rebecca already talked about where you can get access to the documentation. Learning lesson number 3. Costing sensitizes all of us to scale up realities. So for both projects, we undertook a costing exercise to try to come up with estimates of what it would cost to implement the program. This represents TJ. There was a similar one done for GREAT, and this was done during the pilot phase to really pull together all the different elements to see what it would cost. As you can see, one is done by activity, the other by the cost category. For both, pretty much the same, well, 35% and 45%, 48% is the administrative program staff component for this costing. But this is useful information, again, for NGOs, government partners that are interested in taking on these interventions to incorporate within their own programs. Learning number 4. Complexity-aware design, recognizing complex interlocking factors across the social ecology. Now, this is not our focus today, but we thought we would bring to everyone's attention a few of the learnings, understandings that came out, in particular of the cohort studies that were undertaken, which really understanding the complex nature of social and behavior change throughout life. So let's start with family planning, unmet need, and understanding family planning met need. There are a number of building blocks involved. And it's complex and important to understand that all those building blocks are an important component of seeing how you go from meeting unmet need to met need. So there's the knowledge of family planning. There's the community support for family planning. There's fertility intentions, there's access to services, and there's couple communications. And what we learned is that all of these elements are intertwined. And then across all of that is gender. Gender isn't a separate box. it's really part of all those components. And from the studies we've done, we found that taking one of those blocks out can have an impact on whether there is met family planning need or not. And coming out from some studies and looking at analyzing 50 cases over 18 months, we found 9 pathways to meet family planning need. 1 in the green is meeting the need. 2 is unmet need. And the 3rd, the yellow, is ambiguous. So again, we're not going to go into detail, but it kind of gives you some areas for further program interventions or studies on where we can go around family planning, unmet need to met need. The same applies to the GREAT project, where the GREAT cohort study, which followed 10 to 14-year-old boys and girls over 2 years, resulted in this framework, which we call the tree conceptual model. I think we're all trying to use that term for the tree in the middle. And it goes through the different stages, again, those 4 stages, from puberty to sexual debut to marriage and to parenthood, and how youth are grappling with gender and gender norms as they go through each one of those to get to the ultimate outcomes of economic security, good health and access to sexual and reproductive health, school competition. So this kind of intertwines how during the different stages, some of the challenges that youth face around gender. From here, I'm going to pass it on to Brad, who's going to talk a little bit about our biggest challenges in the design.
That helps the transition. Thanks, Danielle. So my role now is to help us close out this first chapter and really reflect on some of the design challenges, but also the solutions that we had, and help all of us think about how we would learn from these challenges for the projects that we're designing. So I've thought about it in 4 different challenge areas. The first one is this idea, and I'm drawing from everything you just heard, so it's just key takeaways for you, really. The first one, the first design challenge area is this idea of KISS, keep it simple and scalable. So some of the questions that we grappled with really were, how do we engage multiple ministries? We engage 3 different ministries, community level stakeholders, and many different community groups along the adolescent life cycle, and also the groups within TJ. How do we engage all of them in the design while still sticking to this KISS principle? So we all know too many cooks in the kitchen can spoil the soup, right? But we were really set on having an award-winning soup. And so we had to think about this, and we knew the important principle of participation in our design and engagement for buy-in, for scale up. So we were constantly going back to, what are we trying to do? How do we engage everyone in that? And where are the decision points? We also, one issue we grappled with around KISS was designing for scale and minimal training inputs. That was our key decision we made, to truly go to scale. We would not do training after training and refresher trainings year after year, every 6 months. And how do you do that, giving enough content that's simple enough, and we iterate and make it more and more simple so people can use it and you don't have to rely on that constant retraining. How do we keep these materials and approaches lean without minimizing the complexities of the social fabric and the complexity of norm change? So we heard from Antje that how complex social norms is, and we don't want to minimize that complexity, but we still want to keep it simple. and by keeping it simple, get to scale. And lastly, how do we ensure that our delivery mechanism, so the existing groups and platforms that we chose, how do we use that delivery mechanism and balance scalability and still achieving deep coverage and scale? So the question you saw with TJ was, do we have enough groups to get to that tipping point? And with GREAT, that big question was, are we reaching enough villages and going deep enough to get that tipping point for norm change? So one of the simplified solutions for us and within this KISS challenge was this creative brief. It was in one of the slides. We created these creative briefs, which really come from this design field and marketing field. It was a bit new for us, but we introduced it in the beginning of the project, both projects, to say, this is the creative that we're taking. These are the questions we will ask during our design to make sure we're keeping it simple and scalable, and putting all our assumptions out on the table at the beginning, and coming back to this as we engage our stakeholders and everyone wants to add stuff in, going back to this creative brief to make sure that we were sticking to these assumptions. That's just one solution. You come up with others. Which color card is this chapter? Is it green? You can write down some other reflections or takeaways or solutions you can think of. So the second area of challenges during the design phase that I want to bring out is this linking to services. So both of these projects and the purpose of these projects were really to shift community norms to increase demands for services. Our remit was not supply side capacity building, but ethically we know, how do you increase demand for, say, family planning services in a context where they might not be there, the quality might not be great, or there might not be great links with the community. And so this is something that we talked a lot about during design phase. We talked about the ethics. I remember many discussions like, how ethical is this? How much can we keep creating demand without that ability to have a strengthened service? So take that away when only working on the demand side. One of our solutions, and something, it might not sound that groundbreaking, but I feel we had to do a lot of legwork. Both projects did a lot of legwork to really map out what supply side capacity strengthening efforts were happening, what other projects were going on and doing this work. And we had to be really active in that legwork and meeting with these very large scale projects. And ours was just seen as this small in the beginning. It was seen as something small. What is this happening? Who's funding this? And little by little, people understood what we were doing, but we really made the effort to understand what supply side strengthening efforts were going on and making sure that we were linking to them and getting them to link to our community groups. So again, linking that's where our remit kind of stopped, but we took it very seriously that we need to link to the service if our ultimate goal is family planning uptake. So the third of 4 challenge areas I want to share with you was really around staff mindset. And when I say staff mindset, I include myself. So it's the HQ technical staff to proposal designers, our field colleagues working with us, and our implementing partners. All of us, it was the staff mindset included all of us, really. So this is an area we talked about really being a paradigm shift for programmers. This whole concept of keeping it simple, beginning with the end in mind, being scalable from day one, and not just focusing on do, reach those targets, get those numbers. It was really a paradigm shift for everyone. We had to really let go of this rigid design model. We created something and this is how it needs to be rolled out. We had to let go of that and iterate and see what was happening in the community. We needed to let go of controlling this diffusion process. So we heard Danielle talk a lot about diffusion throughout her presentation. There's a sense from our programmer to want to control that diffusion. you know, we're talking to you and you must talk to 3 people, or you must now go talk to your neighbor. It just doesn't work like that in the real world. And social, the big S, is real world social life. So we had to let go of that diffusion process, but still, because this is a research project, thinking about how are we going to measure this? How are we going to measure something that we're letting go of? And that was really important to us. We had to set assumptions. Those were the tipping point slides. We had to set some assumptions in the beginning of how we thought things would diffuse so we can measure them. But we had, again, to let go and be comfortable with spontaneous scale up. This group over there wanting to use the materials because they heard it on the radio and now they want them, and programmers having to say, okay, go use them. So the solution here, I think you heard it already, is really just letting go. A mind shift for all the programmers. Linked to the mindset also was our own transformation as staff. Recognizing that we all were bringing our own norms and values around gender and around power and around how programming should be working, but really this transformation that we were all going through together while the program and our community members were going through it. So we wanted to not forget that was happening, and we set up the project. We use this term beginning with the end, looking inward first. It's always what we called it. So we set up these projects for all staff to go through gender and trainings on power at the beginning, looking inward at our own values, so we would be more able and better equipped to move forward with this process, but realizing that that one time training or staff dialogue was going to change our norms, we continued to do this every 3 to 6 months throughout the project. And I think it was important for our own transformation as well. So the last design challenge I want to leave you with, this is less of a challenge we went through in our design, but I think something we can all think about for future design and iterations of both projects, since they have wings, they're going to new countries, to new areas within the countries where they started. It's how do we build on this tested model and this design package that we have that's been tested, but build in some of the new findings and data that this project has generated, because research was happening throughout the whole entire project. And a lot of the data that we even have at the end was from qualitative work throughout the whole entire project. So the one slide that really resonated with me was from the TJ project and the pathways of different individuals to using family planning. And so how would we build in those individual, let's say, market segments of individuals who might be, let's say, I saw the words up there, a quick converter, or they're a determined user. How would you build that into now reusing the same materials, knowing that there's different people with different pathways to FP or family planning use? And I think that will be the exciting part of the future iterations. So I'll close out chapter 1, and I'm going to hand it off to the chapter 2 speakers.
So I'd like to invite our monitoring evaluation team, who are going to be the ones who are presenting the results. So we have Miriam Becker-Benton from Mali, Antje Becker-Benton from India, now from Mali, and Sam Okello from Uganda, and then Nana Dagabu from BC are all going to share in these results. And also I'd like to ask you if anyone has questions on the first context or the first chapter. Could you, I think Monica's going to watch around the collection so I can be organizing them, because you're probably going to have a lot more questions on this one. So Miriam's going to start.
Can I just say one thing? The people who are in the Zoom room, if they have questions, please just chat them and we'll be collecting those also.
We're documenting those.
Thank you, Rebecca. It is a pleasure for me to be here presenting TG Fountain and on behalf of IRH and TG team. You certainly notice that my English is not fluent, and I beg your patience and will do my best to make you catch what I am saying. So, TG project, design and testing an intervention to diffuse new ideas and behavior through social networks. So we looked at in two types of results. At first time in individual level on attitude, self-efficacy, and behavior. And the second level, social network, like couple communication and communication through our social network, and expectation supporting FPUs. And all of these we use to reach both men and women. So we will look at link to the life courses we target on the couple married person. Here we have some results as they mentioned my previous intervening, so that TG after proved successful during the pilot stage. We revise the intervention package and then we scale through 4 community-based programs. So the results we are sharing are from the evaluation of the scale-up phases. Here we see the percentage of men and women who were engaged during intervention. So most of our results are from the end line. So you can see the green color representing women and blue one men. We reach about 50% of men and women, so the tipping point with the intervention. So as you can see here, for this stage, we had a greater percentage than pilot phases. Here we did a comparison with persons who were exposed to the intervention and those who were not exposed. Again, in green color, we have women and blue one, men. And dark color represent people who were exposed and light one who were not exposed. As we can say, our formative research result, we found that one of the social factors is the lack of communication between partners and between social networks. So men and women exposed in TG intervention are much more likely to discuss with the social network people and also to share information and the experience on FPUs. So this can suggest that the strategy of decision is working here. Now, from the percentage, we use the odds ratio here from logistic regression. As you can see, it is again compare people who were exposed to TG and those not exposed. For this, we adjust the selected demographic characteristic to do the comparison. As you can see here, men and women who were exposed to interpersonal communication, that means all our components presented by Danielle except radio 1. So people who were exposed to that, both men and women, are significantly more likely to discuss with their partner and about which method used or how to obtain it. For example, there are women exposed to the intervention are 6 times more likely to discuss with partner about which method to use. Now, this is the exposure to radio. Only we focus on method use and met FP need. As you can see, women who were exposed are almost 7 times more likely to use FP. It is similar for met FP need. So we can say that TG intervention was effective in increasing FP use. As you can see here, we have baseline result on orange color, if I can see that, and end line in yellow color. We have intervention area in my left and control in my right. So we can see that among women in the intervention area, they were significantly increasing in FPUs in intervention area from baseline to end line. But when we look at in control area, it is not the case. So for our learning number 5, approaches that focus on social network expectations and communication leads to family planning update. And during our analysis, both of evaluation, both pilot result and scale-up result demonstrated that focus on social factor linked to FPUs can significantly improve family planning use in the area with our weak family planning use as Benin and most of West Africa countries. So for this, that's it for this part. I thank you for your patience.
So I'd just like to thank Miriam and also make a personal comment that when we hired Miriam 6 years ago, she didn't speak English. So it's pretty impressive. And then also to introduce Sam Okello from Uganda.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. So we shall turn to GREAT. And just to refresh you that GREAT materials are focused on catalyzing reflections between boys and girls, women and men, but also focusing on different life stages. So that is what GREAT was focusing on. So again, also the results that I'll share with you is at 2 levels. Some of them at individual, and then other results will be at focusing on the social environment. So GREAT, as you can see, we did analysis based on the different life stages. And then one thing we have to note here is that the serial radio drama had a broad reach. So we had to use propensity score analysis, comparing results from the exposed group and comparing it with the simulated match control. Of course, taking care of the differences in the demographics between the two. So exposure to GREAT resulted in a more gender equitable attitudes and behavior. As you can see here, this side, half of the slide, which is on my side, is that fewer newly married adolescents believed education is more important for boys than girls. That this is an example of an equitable behavior. But also more adolescents believed men and women are equal. So that is the effect of the exposure. You can see the figures. In terms of gender-based violence behaviors and attitude, again, we can see that those who were exposed to the great intervention are less likely, to react violently to a partner, especially when they're in sort of disagreement. But also we see that less old adolescents reported sexual harassment as a result of exposure to GRADE. GRADE did focus on adults, which provide an enabling environment for adolescents, especially on matters of adolescent sexual and reproductive health. And we can see here that the adults that were exposed to GRADE were more likely to provide support, various kinds of support, emotional, material, and the rest, but also advice on family planning to adolescents. We think that with all these resulted into our ultimate outcome, which we see here that a greater discussion and use on family planning. Generally, if you see these two slides which are divided in half. So our learning number 6, that addressing gender across life domains at different life stages leads to an improved sexual and reproductive health. So this was revealed by our evaluation, but also qualitative data that focusing on this fosters critical reflection, especially on gender, but also focusing on the different domains of life stages. But also you have to tailor your programs by the life course, as it was represented in the 3 conceptual model. This is a summary of it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sam. So my job today is just to share with you all some of our team's reflections on what these results mean, and really also the challenges in terms of measuring some of the concepts that you've heard about today. So I am going to share those challenges and solutions with you in sort of 3 questions. So the first question was, so we have the results, now what? As Brad mentioned previously, both of these projects, interventions, have actually been scaled up in their respective countries, and have been also expanded to other regions of the countries and then to other countries. So we might say that they are covering a lot of ground. Now, we haven't gone back and looked at the continued effect. We have these changes in behavior and knowledge and attitudes, but what happens once the projects end, as both of these did last September? TJ went back after the pilot stage during the scale up and looked at what happened in the pilot areas, but both have not yet been back to see if the effects you just heard from Mariam and Sam have continued. I think one thing that shows a lot of promise is in future projects. So we have passages and other projects such as GAGE, the Global Early Adolescent Study, and other initiatives where we might be able to go back and look longitudinally at the progression of these changes, both at knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors at individual and community level, as we saw in both of the projects. The second question that our teams reflected on in terms of results, is it feasible to measure change in this way? So I propose the answer that it is not easy, but it is doable. We are working in contexts that are not labs, but rather actual communities. So we don't have control over all the elements of the people, the processes, and the various products. I think Brad alluded to this in his comments. We are also trying to measure things in a time-bound way that doesn't work in the communities. Some of the ways that we try to do this, for example, were the cohort studies, where we try to look across time and see change happening sort of in real time. Secondly, we also had to operationalize and streamline very complex constructs such as gender, even talking about social networks. You've heard a lot of talk about the tipping point and diffusion. How do you ask participants or community members about diffusion? You have to ask specific questions. You might have to use little stories, vignettes, to get them to talk about these things. And usually you have maybe an hour or an hour and a half to get at some of those questions and cover a lot of ground. And so we really had to be specific and try to get down to key questions, key ideas that would help to represent some of these more complicated constructs. One area of future inquiry that our teams have struggled with, or that might have some promise for other research, is to look at dosage and sort of the effect of combining various components. So as you saw with TJ, there were 5 components, and then with GREAT, there were 4 components. If you add several different age cohorts and possibly even different locations, that makes for some pretty complicated combinations. So we found that radio in both projects was able to cover the majority, and yet bolstered by some of these critical reflections and dialogues that were ongoing. Future research might be useful to share how various combinations. I think people often ask, well, which one's more important? Which component do you really, really need, particularly in the context of scaling up under minimal resources? So if I want to do this elsewhere, and we've said, you have a how-to guide, you have all these things that can help you, how do you decide which pieces are most critical? And I think some of those questions are still to be determined in some of the future initiatives that we can do. And then finally, the third question that I would propose, how do you assign importance or value? In both Mariam and Sam's presentations, you saw we noted the odds ratios or the p-values, and our teams on both projects had a lot of discussion about what do those actually mean? What does it mean when we look at our qualitative data as well, which for some folks in our, among our stakeholders, were maybe different ways of looking at results. In that sense, we came to the point where we noticed that stakeholders come with, stakeholders including ourselves, our own consortia, have different ideologies. We come to the table with different lenses and objectives. And so how do you translate and make meaning out of results to sort of satisfy or make sense to these various stakeholders? What we did in both TJ and GREAT was to use multiple types of evidence. So both quantitative and qualitative, and I will be the first to say that that took even me out of my comfort zone, because I came from a more quantitative background. And I know that for many of our team members, it was sort of similar, whether qualitatively inclined or quantitatively inclined. So learning to be flexible with the methods that we're using and the measures, and then also not relying on one statistical measure, but really to triangulate and come at a combined sense of meaning. Then finally, then translating that into something that is of value and importance for the various stakeholders at village, parish, district, national, and we might also say global level. I won't go into too much detail because the next chapter will go into how we actually did some of that translating.
Thank you, Nana. Very insightful as always. So I would like to introduce our dear colleague, Callie Simon from Pathfinder International, who's come all the way from Seattle to be with us today. And then she'll be followed by Susan Egris, who will give some of the reflections. Thanks, Callie.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So really exciting to be here. It's so much fun to take a look back on such a long project, and two projects that adapted so significantly over time. And I have the pleasure and honor of talking about one of my favorite topics, which is adaptation as we implement. So GREAT and TJ, through those projects, we were piloting and scaling up dynamic social change projects. And by their very nature, these projects must respond to the social context in which they're being implemented. And as we all know from our current life in the US, the social context in which we live is not static. It is always changing. It is always moving forward or moving backwards. It is always changing. And projects sometimes can help that change. But regardless, our projects have to change as the environment they work in changes. As a colleague of mine at Pathfinder often says, he says, adaptation of our projects is a fact of life. It happens. It's what we do with it as programmers that really matters. And so I think one of the important stories of GREAT and TJ is that from day one, we collectively embraced the fact that we were endeavoring to change social norms. We were endeavoring to change the context in which we worked. And by virtue of doing that, we would have to carefully understand how the projects were being implemented, how they were adapting on their own over time, how the context in which we were working was changing and adapting, and how we should be proactively adapting those projects to respond to that changing context. And as Nana and Brad and others have said, in order to do that, we had to think carefully about what information we needed to do that over time. Because effectiveness data, pre and post evaluation results, as you've seen, can tell us a lot, but it often does not tell us much about the story of how programs are being implemented and how they're being changed and adapted over time. And so we had to think really carefully about what other data and information to collect and how we can use that information to be proactive in changing our approaches and fine-tuning our approaches as we went along. And so to support this learning and adaptation, both GREAT and TJ drew on the principles and approaches of implementation science. And I will show you. Okay, so implementation science, many of us have heard a lot about that term lately. It has several different definitions out there. Here is the one that the consortia for GREAT and TJ used. It's a working definition, and you can see that it says the study of methods to promote the adoption, and integration of evidence-based practices, interventions, and policies into routine healthcare and public health settings. In short, I like to say that implementation science is the study of how evidence-based practices are translated and implemented in real-world, complex, and ever-changing contexts. Implementation science helps us and helped us, the programs, learn the barriers, enablers of effective program implementation, and helped us to address implementation bottlenecks as we went along. So how did we do this? In both GREAT and TJ, there was a process implemented throughout the projects of learning and reflection and action. So as you can see here, through the cycles, project staff sought to understand what's happening. Are we remaining true to our values, such as gender equity? Are communities liking the interventions? How are they responding to the interventions? What are we seeing in our monitoring data and our qualitative data as we go? This process of awareness and understanding of processing the data led to decisions around action. What do we do as a result of what we're seeing happening? The program would take action, and then there'd be a process of reflection. What do we see as a result of that action? Are we seeing improvements in the challenges we're trying to address? Are we seeing further challenges that are happening? And these cycles happened fairly regularly, every 3 to 6 months. And importantly, they included staff and stakeholders at a wide range of levels within the project. So these processes included not just the M&E folks, which sometimes we see, right, in our projects, just the M&E folks see the data and think, oh, there's a problem, and then nothing happens. Sometimes it includes just the programmers who are using just their own experiences, which are really, really important, but not triangulating that with project data. And in Great and TJ, these reflection and action processes happened with all project staff at different levels and at different moments. So that included the frontline implementers, the implementing partners, the M&E staff, the project folks. Sometimes it went beyond that at certain periods and included the technical advisory group or the stakeholders involved in the project. Sometimes it included staff in the US along with staff in the different countries where you're working. And so these processes were multidimensional and included a range of perspectives. And as I noted, they drew on both monitoring data, qualitative and quantitative, and the experiences and observations of the staff themselves, which I feel we sometimes don't use well enough in our programs, because these experiences, what they're seeing on the ground, what they're experiencing, how they are adapting their own work is critical for our learning and understanding. And both Great and TJ tried really hard to gather that information and use it in a very rigorous and robust way. And as a result of that, made adaptations as the project went along in the pilot phase, intentionally between pilot and scale up, and then throughout the scale up phase. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the key questions that were asked as part of these kind of understanding and awareness reflection cycles. The questions varied over time. They were made more specific to each project in the 2 different countries. But the questions included things like, what are the data telling us? What is our field experience telling us? Do these things match? Are they contradictory? Why? Are there social changes related to the interventions that are happening that we're seeing? We would also perhaps ask, are there other social changes that might be unrelated to interventions that we're seeing that we need to respond to? What needs to be managed and what needs to be adjusted? You'll see that these questions focus on managing activities, but also on observations of social changes and community reactions, understanding that learning about context is critical to inform our implementation science approaches. So now I'll offer up 2 examples, both from TJ, of decisions made during these learning or reflections meetings and how they influenced the project. So when monitoring data revealed that in TJ they were not getting enough men's groups to ensure gender equity, they asked field supervisors to do a small evaluation or talk with these men's groups to understand why this was happening. In the end, they changed the definition of groups to include informal male groups to reach more male participants. In addition, another example, when an analysis of transcripts of call-ins to radio broadcasts of TJ stories showed that 98% of men were callers and their comments were reinforced inequitable gender norms, they reflected on what could be done, considering also the mandate of scalability. And they thought about doing more training of DJs or perhaps getting the MOH more involved in monitoring, but those are very difficult to scale. And as a result, decided to scrap the call-in component so as to not reinforce inequitable gender norms. So that brings us to learning number 7. This process of iteration and learning brings us to understand that adaptive interventions and approaches can significantly improve how staff understand and contribute to interventions, as well as improving the effectiveness or the impact of the intervention. And our own staff and our partner staff and our Ministry of Health colleagues' understanding of how the interventions are happening, how they can be improved, and what they can do to improve them is critical to the success of interventions, and often can be missed if you're not really carefully focusing on that as part of your adaptation. Okay. So as an example of what happens when you do make changes, again from the TJ project, the data comparing the pilot to what happened during scale up, you can see the improvement in men's exposure to the intervention and the resulting improvement in the odds ratio of family planning use. So it shows how learning and adaptation as we go can make substantial improvements in the effects of the program overall. And with that, I will pass to Susan.
Thanks. It's a really interesting approach using participatory monitoring, learning, and evaluation. And it can be really challenging to our staff. And I think that was some of our learning, because as Callie was saying, you know, M&E can be put in its own little box and it can stay in its own little box. And there's not always that systematic interpretation with program people to improve programs, which is kind of the whole point of M&E. So these participatory approaches create these spaces so that these things can happen. And I think that's one of our, I mean, it's not our learning, but it's how we applied this implementation science approach. But it challenged our M&E staff often. It challenged our program staff because they weren't used to talking together. And I think I should talk more from the TJ perspective, because that's the one that I was most involved in. But you know, the M&E people didn't necessarily bring in the program people, and they were uncomfortable when the program people, when we were saying, let's bring the program people in with M&E people and look at the data together and look at experience together and see what that actually means in terms of improving programs. So it was just interesting. And one of the things that we did to help broker that was create these structures. In TJ, we had MLE committees, so that there was a structure when people met, and kind of that intersection was permitted and allowed, and then people could use it. I want to talk a little bit about this whole process of adaptation, and it has some limits. It's not like free-form adaptation. You know, I think for us, the big concern as we were going through scale up is how do you adapt to a new NGO environment? Because we were trying to add the TJ approach into the NGO existing programs without losing fidelity to that original model, without most critically losing the inherent values in these social change models. And so there had to be decisions, and not necessarily negotiations, but reflections, like if we're going to do this, is that going to disrupt the model so much that it's no longer the model? So those are the kinds of reflections that, again, using these kinds of approaches allow you to have those kinds of discussions. Callie was talking about experiential data, which I call experiential data, but you know, we have evidence-informed decision-making, but we have also experience-informed decision-making. And how do you capture that? I think great was using diaries and for field staff to note changes that were going on. You know, that's one way. What we were trying to do in TJ was not that sort of a daily approach, but coming together every 6 months and doing a series of reflection exercises. So you have enough time for people to have gained enough experience through their observations and at the field level, then they have time to reflect on it. So we did a lot of participatory exercises, even with the staff, to answer questions like, how do you know that social change is happening? You know, what are you seeing and observing? And what's that chain of action reaction that you're seeing, you know, to help us sort of capture that in a more systematic way. A really important thing when you're trying to bring in different kinds of stakeholders, including staff, also relates to data visualization. And it's not just looking at tables, but it's really how do you create data in visual ways that allow people to really kind of understand it and use it and think about what it means for their decisions. So we spent a lot of time on that. Mariam became our expert whiz in creating these beautiful graphs that would compile the monitoring data that we used. Some of the other sort of small target evaluations that we did to answer certain questions that arose along the way, but it was really critical to help people so you had a common understanding of what the data were that you were looking at. But some of the challenges with that too is time. You know, we're constantly, first it's a consortium project, and we're trying to engage program staff and MLE staff across different organizations, and they all have different priorities. They're all being pulled different ways. So how do you actually broker that so that people come together? So again, through these MLE committee structures, were really critical for giving people permission in some ways to focus on it. But Mariam has a lot of stories to tell you during break about, you know, how do you negotiate? How do you get people to really spend the time that's needed? You know, and also we are an applied research project, but even if you're not and you want to use data in a participatory way, how do you get people to engage in it when they're stretched for time? Two things though that came out of this experience, and it came out through the assessment of integration that we did with TJ that Marcy led, was how much people appreciated going through the process, how much more program staff understood how data could be used for programs, but how M&E staff also understood and appreciated better how they were using their data. So all 4 organizations that were involved in the scale-up phase of the TJ project, when we were asking them about one of the important changes that happened to them organizationally, we marked that our M&E systems have actually improved because of these approaches, because we're now more conscious of quality data, and we're now more conscious of using data for decision making and kind of looking at data not just in a but a project results framework, but in something that's more viable and livable and usable, actionable. Yeah, I think the only other challenge, which is somewhat unrelated, but we faced it in TJ, was, and I think people alluded to it, was this sort of spontaneous diffusion that starts happening with scale up, right? So in GREAT, people want to use use the toolkit. TJ, we didn't even know it, but in a couple of the organizations of our partners, new projects had started using parts of the TJ and GREAT approach, right? And that's real issues for contamination of studies, for one thing, but also, let's try and, we think these really are wonderful tools and approaches, but let's wait a bit and just get some evidence on how they're working before we really start trying to scale them up. But again, this participatory MLE approaches allows you to really be aware, well, not always aware, because we were kind of surprised when we found out that one project had started using it, but at least, because we're all very siloed too in our work, but at least to be aware of the need to do this sort of constant scanning of the environment, and then when you see things starting to happen, negotiate with a project to say, please don't start that for another 6 months, right? Because we need to finish this kind of understanding of how this pilot to scale effort is going. So I think those are kind of the things that I would comment on. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I have a lot of questions here, and we have 10 minutes for some clarifying questions. So I'm going to try to pick out some of the questions that I think are going to be most helpful, because our next step will be going into a panel with more reflection. So to speed things up, I'd like to ask Danielle, Susan, Miriam, Sam, and Callie to come sit up here so I can kind of pass the microphone to you. And I will start with the first question for Susan. So, because I think this is such a key part of our presentation, is talking about the tipping point. So the tipping point, you can pull that chair. So the questions on the tipping point are, how did we define it? What does the tipping point mean to us? Why is it 50% in TJ and 30% in GREAT? I can answer that one if you want, Susan. How do we know we reached the tipping point? And is the tipping point number of groups or number of people? Do you need me to repeat that? Okay, maybe I'll read a couple other questions. So that's all sort of around the tipping point. And then Callie, I think this is an important question, that because we only presented a few of the GREAT results, so I just kind of want to give a little context. That we had boys and girls, 4 different life stages, 3 different outcomes. So the results are very complicated, in that some things worked really well for certain ages, for certain sexes, for certain outcomes, and others didn't. So, and I think somebody asked, well, are you only showing the positive results? And it is the case. We only showed a few of the snapshots of the positive results. So not everything worked for everyone, but overall, we found, it's kind of Nana's discussion, there was a sense that the intervention is effective. But the question that I wanted Callie to comment on, if change is mixed, do you suggest projects focus on only the segments where there was the greatest change? Yeah, if there's another mic, that would be good. So that's a question for Callie. So for Danielle, how are the discussions facilitated after the radio program? Clarifying question there. Were facilitators paid? to participate in the activities, to lead activities. Sam, I'm going to ask you about the ethnographers. What did they use participant observation? How long were they in the field, and who were they? So start with Susan. Whatever you want to say about
Whatever I want to say, and then whatever anyone else wants to add in. The tipping point is really interesting because, as I think Danielle was saying, we weren't so conscious of it as we began, right? But as we moved into it, we became very conscious of the critical importance of understanding. It's kind of like where we're going, right? If we're trying to affect normative change. And it's easy in a service delivery project where you're trying to, get functional clinics providing, this quality of services. That's a different kind of tipping point. We were looking for a normative change tipping point. So that kind of shifted everything. So we started looking in the literature to try and find out what is said about it. And so this is now probably 5 years ago. There really wasn't that much out there. We saw some evaluations from HIV, some mathematical modeling actually of people, but from the 90s, right? But so what we were seeing was between 25 and 50% of a population being exposed to new ideas hypothetically leads to a tipping point of normative change. And so that was sort of our working assumption. And then we started working backwards, as Daniel was saying. So if we're really trying to be scalable, we want a minimal set of strategic actors that will diffuse out new ideas. What is that minimum that we need in order to, at the end of, in our case, I think it was 12 months, achieve that 50% exposure level or tipping point. So that's sort of how we worked backward. Now, GREAT was really different because it was a more spread out intervention. Ours was every single component was reaching the village level. And so we could really look at it sort of at a population level within a village. And GREAT had a bigger challenge in terms of defining what their tipping point is. And I don't know if I can say so much more about GREAT. Maybe other people can comment.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say, I know Brad and Kelly, we could talk the whole day on this, but why 30 versus 50? And it was just kind of a vestige of Googling tipping points at a project meeting and figuring out what we thought would work. And the two consortia came up with a different estimate. Yes, nothing very magical. And then I think there was a question about how do you know it worked? So if you see the results, we know 50% worked for TJ, 30% didn't. Or the lower amount didn't, because we have the difference between pile and scale up. And we know for GREAT that we didn't achieve the tipping point. So we're seeing the GREAT results, we see exposed versus not exposed, but we don't see results across the whole community. So that's probably not clear from the results we showed. But so we saw results at the individuals who were listened to the radio, they had better outcomes as opposed to those who did not. But we don't have, we actually couldn't really analyze it because everyone was exposed to the radio, including the control villages. But anyway, our bottom line is we think 30%, we didn't reach it in GREAT, and we did reach it in TJ. So I'm going to, are you ready? Callie, how about Callie?
You gave me a very difficult question, and I am not a very good politician, and if I were, I would be able to somehow answer your question without exactly answering your question. But so the question was, if change is mixed, would we want to only focus on the segments with the greatest change, if I understand correctly? And I don't know that we can make that judgment call based on what we learned in GREAT. I think we might have a couple of things that I could observe, and I'd love other colleagues who worked on the project to answer. One, I think, is we started with the theory that if you intervene at multiple different levels, they will reinforce one another, because the very young adolescents, they have older brothers and sisters. The older adolescents, by the end of the project, they're going to be newly married and parenting. And if we're not intervening at all those levels, then we maybe will not affect social change in the way we would like to. So there was sort of a theory behind this not only the idea that, of course, a 10-year-old needs different information than a 19-year-old, which we all know, not only the fact that they have different SRH needs, which we all know, but also the idea that if you intervene at all those levels, you might get closer to achieving social change. And so GREAT doesn't tell us whether or not that theory, I think, worked. We don't have the results to show that, but I still believe that theory could be true. So I would hate to say, yeah, forget all the other segments and just focus on one segment, personally. I would also say that, as Rebecca noted, We ultimately, the measures that we were seeking to affect as goals were around use of contraception, experience of SGBV. We know that those things are more likely to happen as an adolescent gets older. So a 19-year-old is going to be more likely to need contraception than a 10-year-old. And so I think when we're talking about different segments and we're asking the question, like if you see less effect, we need to be very clear about what effect we expect to see with that population. With the 10 to 14-year-old, success could very well be measured by increased bodily knowledge, reporting different ideas around what a brother and a sister should be doing in the household. And we shouldn't say that just because we didn't see contraception use increase among that population, then it's less effective intervention among that population. So yes, we saw more contraception use among newly married and parenting. I hope we would. That makes sense. They have a stronger need for contraception, and I feel like it's great. It's great that influence that. But that doesn't mean that we would stop intervening or give up interventions with very young or older adolescents. So those are some thoughts on the subject. Perhaps not a very clear answer, but I don't know. Brad, do you want to add anything? Am I not? Sorry, I'm not the moderator. I just don't like Brad to not talk after me.
Well, I thought it was an excellent response, actually. On the very young, I'll just add to the very young adolescent component, because if we were to go by this question, we'd probably give up the very young adolescent component, because we don't, as you saw, there was no results shown on the slides, and we're still grappling with the types of measures that we would use for very young adolescents, and then and especially around gender and norm change, but then the types of behaviors that seem meaningful to us. Is helping out in the household meaningful enough as it relates later to family planning use? And we're trying to learn that. And so we did the opposite of what this question is suggesting. We have actually now in DRC are replicating only the very young adolescent components, but we're linked to a longitudinal study to actually see what this foundational work in younger adolescents leads to as they grow up. And I think it is a key research question. If we had more money, we would have brought the other pieces as well, because we still truly believe in what Callie said, that doing all three at the same time does have this reinforcing nature, because they are, again, this is real world research, real world interventions, and they are living together in a community, in a household. So.
Sure. No, but I think that the other argument for keeping these interventions intact is the mutually reinforcing, even from in the TJ project in the pilot, we were looking to really diffuse through men's social networks and women's social networks, because they had to work together. And when we did the end line survey of the pilot, it was clear that men were more influenced by certain kinds of activities than women were, and vice versa. So if you're really trying to think gender synchronized, it's not like it's going to be one size fit all. Men were much more influenced by radio in terms of attitudinal change, whereas women, it was the group discussion, for example.
Thanks, Susan. So we are kind of out of question time, but I'm going to have Danielle answer some clarifying questions about TJ.
Okay, I think one here, and correct me if I'm wrong, was how are discussions facilitated around family planning social norms after the radio? So one of the things, because I know radio ends up being a little bit of the focus, but keeping in mind that on the TJ, the radio episodes were actually just the recording of the group discussions. So a lot of the central part of the intervention was around the storyboards, which were, going back, you can see the networks, you had catalyzers, which were individuals within those networks that actually led discussions for these storyboards of these stories. And those stories were like chapters. There were some activity cards. So they were stories that had characters as part of it. And then at the end of each story were questions to sort of stimulate discussions with underlying themes around couple decision-making, family planning. And our aim was not to provide information, but just to stimulate that thought process with these underlying questions, these underlying norms that people would reflect on. So it was just a discussion. Our catalyzers did not give information. So if people asked for information on family planning, it was referrals. So they took off their IE&C hat if they were relays, for example, and just literally did the discussion points. So that got carried into the radios. So what would happen, for example, maybe in the next session is a catalyzer might say, well, did you listen to the radio, which just reinforced those stories. So when it came around, if you were looking at how was it processed around family planning information or questions that people had, really that's where we did the linkages to the family planning providers, because they were the ones with the information. And that also does the quality control of not giving misinformation around family planning. I mean, our catalyzers were not family planning providers. So the facilitation was simply, did you hear the radio? Did that reconfirm our discussions in our group? And that's again where we let go. It was the diffusion, it was the dialogue, and going to the health service providers for any really information on services. I think there was the one thing about IPC. Please explain the term IPC and how it's used in communicating TJ, because taking out the radio gets back to those dialogue sessions to really reflect on the stories and the stimulating questions that people would have and discuss, where again it was left open-ended, but people thought about it, and the diffusion, you know, speaking to others outside your network and keeping that going. So that's sort of the intercommunication that went on and how we tried to bring around social change and social norms.
So what should I do? Should we end? Okay, so we should go ahead. Okay, so Sam, do you want to talk about the ethnographers?
Yeah, thank you. The question of ethnography represents how your MLE should be very adaptive. So when we're building our MLE strategy, we knew that different questions needs to be answered in different ways. And by the complex nature of social change, we needed people to do observations and follow how, you know, fidelity, scalability, interaction with the materials. So that's when we decided ethnography could be one of the best ways to answer some of the questions. So we designed the tools, we adapted the tools as you know, the work was going, and we were working in two different ethnic areas. So we had two different ethnographers embedded in those communities, and they were linking with the program staff. They follow every single program activities that is going on, and they stayed there for about a period of 1 year for scale up. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to ask you another question. This is an online question, so I want to make sure to ask this one. Were the monitoring, learning, and evaluation committees only with staff or also with stakeholders? If just with staff, how were findings shared with the stakeholders?
Yeah, the MLE committees were, again, also very responsive to the program. So we had different levels of partners. One level was the category that is, you know, a national CBO that is engaging with communities on a daily basis. We had served another level had served the children and IRH and Pathfinder. So we had a combination of both levels, but also at different times we would engage the organizations that are engaging, you know, who are expanding the model. Together with the district people, we would share, we would identify their capacity gaps in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and the resource team would go ahead and try to help them work around to better do the monitoring. So one was learning, but also feedback at different levels, not only at that level, but also we had an advisory committee of experts and ministry. We would still again share this feedback from the data, and decisions would be made. I would say it was in different directions depending on the need. Thank you.
Are we okay? Okay, so Miriam is going to answer the question about why the TJ baseline results were so different for family planning use, if she can.
I will try, because when we select the control area, we use some criteria as FPU's TPC rate and also unmet need rate, CPR in English, oh sorry. Also, there are a social factor. So the WEME were the experimental area and Atlantic, the control area. So if we ask me where the control and experience baseline level so different, it might be a geographical context. It's difficult for me to answer with certainly answer it, but I know where we, how to say, we implement TG, even those during baseline we have difference, but after end line, we saw that in the intervention area, there is increasing in FPUs. So I don't know if I have respond the person. So I saw a end, yes.
Mihir, you want to clarify?
One of the biggest issues with research like this, that you don't have the freedom to pick communities completely at random and try to find and have enough resources to do baselines across a lot of different communities and then choose matching ones. Here, for political reasons, where the missions allow you to work, all those things factor in. So you are given communities at the end, saying you can work here and here. And so you hope, for the most part, that they'll be pretty similar. You go with many of the external factors that you already have information on. And then you go into a baseline and my gosh, they are not that similar when it comes to CPR. But you are at that point, you don't have the freedom or the flexibility to go and find another community that's going to match the workload because it is very expensive. So you go with, that's why these are not randomized trials. And when you actually randomize communities, you get the real deal. But this is about the best you can do with quasi-experimental and with all the political stuff and other reasons why you are given communities. But the biggest thing I think is, in spite of that, the fact that you saw those bigger jumps is at least some indication that they're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and we've done, of course, we're not sharing it with you today, but we have done a lot of analysis with the TJ results with different kind of statistical methods, different kind of regressions, and the results are very consistent in different ways, control versus, exposed versus non-exposed, control, intervention, putting time into the models, et cetera. But I do want to say, because someone asked this, the men's results are not as positive as the women's. We see increased communication, we see increased intention to use, but for TJ, but not increased family planning use or met need. So that, holds up with all the different kinds of analysis. We were lucky enough to find an analyst at the University of Maryland, a statistician that did her dissertation on these data. So, but the general trend is that men's improved in all areas except for actual use. And why, that's a big question. They have multiple partners, so we had to, it's much more complicated to measure. There's a lot of different reasons, but just to lay that out there. Just a clarifying question, someone asked if facilitators or catalyzers received an incentive for leading activities. So in neither project did they, where they were not paid. If they traveled outside of their village to a training, they might have received transport, but they weren't paid or anything else. And I think we should move on at that point. Does anyone on the panel have anything burning question they would like? There's some really great questions here, and we will try to answer them and send it out to everyone who enrolled in the webinar. Anyone? And the point at next, so the exciting next step is that Caitlin Thistle is going to come up here, and she is going to be joined by Karen Hardy and Tashina, who are going to reflect a little bit from an external point of view on some of the big issues. And then I think they're going to open it up to further questions and discussion. So thanks for all of our great panelists.
So the first thing I'd really like all of us to do, because I need to do it and I want you all to join me, is to stand up and stretch. So let's do that. Good job. So you stand up, you put your hands above your head, grab your wrist and go to the side. Thank you for joining me. You're not going to let a pregnant woman stretch by herself. Okay. So first, I will do some introductions. Then I'll talk a little bit about the objectives of this panel, and then give you a bit of an outline. I think we have until 3:30. Okay. And we'll certainly open this up to Q&A with you all as well. So first, my name is Caitlin Thistle. I work at USAID in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health in Mihira's Division of Research, Technology, and Utilization. I'm a technical advisor, and I am joined by two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Tashina Okigbe. I was going to ask you before, but I didn't get you. Is a, let's see, Senior Technical Officer for Community-Based Family Planning with JSI and FHI 360. They get to share you, right? And Dr. Karen Hardy, who is a Senior Associate at the Population Council and the Project Director of the Evidence Project. So those are your introductions. So this panel is really about reflecting and starting our discussion on all of that great information that we just heard. So first, I am going to go ask Rebecca to go to the next slide. First, I'm kind of going to put a panel hat on and review the learnings that we have on the screen. And also give a little bit of the donor perspective here. So these are things that have already been presented. And so we just want to reiterate what learnings we move forward with. First, that normative change requires community level changes. This is kind of a no-brainer for me, right? Like, what are social norms? They are beliefs of social expectations of behavior. So it makes sense that this has to happen at the community level. We're not talking about individual behavior change anymore. And the next two really kind of go together. When designing for scale, remember to keep it simple and scalable, and that costing is important. From my perspective, what I hear at USAID is more and more we are asking for population level impact. We're asking our missions, like not only what high impact practices are you doing, but at what scale, right? We don't want to know that you're doing everything. We want to know at what scale are you doing the most effective interventions in family planning. And we all know resources in family planning are probably not going up anytime soon. They are most likely going down. So what that means is that scale is even more important. We're even more interested in things that have population level impact. And when our office is looking across projects and deciding what to fund, normative change is so difficult, and it's the long-term game, right? But so there are definitely questions of, well, should we, stay with the low-hanging fruit? And at this point, and I am confident moving forward, the answer will be no, that we will continue to have the foresight to continue to fund normative change interventions and research to better understand what these things, what they look like in the field and how to get impact at scale, of course. Fourth, one of the learnings is complexity-aware design. And I hear a lot more of this, especially when we talk about human-centered design. At first I was like, wait, what is this? Like, haven't we been doing this for years? But it does seem, the more I hear about it, the more it seems like We are moving forward with designing interventions with a greater acknowledgement of the complexity in which we're working. What we try to do is really, really difficult. And that kind of ties into number 7, that adaptive intervention approaches are really important, and continuous learning is really important. You know, there are days that I don't even understand. I don't even feel like I understand my own community, my own nation, you know, nonetheless, like, you know, sub-Saharan African countries. You know, I lived in rural Tanzania for a year. And when I got on the plane after a year of living there, I'm like, I only scratched the surface. So, you know, we move forward with a healthy acknowledgement of the complexity of what we're trying to accomplish. And then finally, just 5 and 6, I want to provocatively put the word can in both of these learnings, that approaches that focus on social network expectations and communication can lead to family planning uptake, and addressing gender across life domains can lead to improved SRH. I think, you know, implementation is really important, but both of these projects help us understand that these things can lead to impact. So now I'm going to take off my panel hat, my panelist hat, and I'm going to put on my facilitator hat and go on to the, thank you, Rebecca, go on to the discussion questions. So we have Karen, who's going to give us the research perspective, and Tashina, who will give us the implementer perspective. And I'll ask Tashina to go first to share her reflections and maybe try to address a little bit of that first question, which is how can we better integrate social influences into scalable behavior change programs?
Thank you, everyone. So I'm just going to give you guys a general overview of what we did. So as Caitlin said, I'm Tashina, and I work on the APC project, which is Advancing Partners and Communities. So for those who don't know, it's a project that is implemented in partnership with JSI and FHI 360. And it advances and supports community programs that seek to improve the overall health of communities, as well as achieve health-related impacts, especially in relationship to family planning. And so what we did in Uganda through a buy-in, APC in partnership and collaboration with Concerned Parents Association and Straight Talk Foundation, we scaled up and enhanced the GREAT model with these two organizations. And so we did that by linking with VHT's village health teams and linked these VHTs directly with youth to provide them with sexual and reproductive health service delivery services. And so I'll tell you guys a little bit about this. And so the APC, so just to be crystal clear, I wasn't directly involved with this work, so I'm presenting on behalf of a coworker. So if you guys have questions, I'll try to do as best as I can, but I am filling in for someone. So APC trained the VHTs to better serve the youth and directly link the great groups that were trained by RRH with APC VHTs that were trained by APC. Where previously these services were not necessarily emphasized within the communities. And so we also did a series of health fairs within these communities. And so the health fairs provided an opportunity for contraceptive methods to be presented to communities for information on the contraceptive methods to be available. Methods that were available included injectables, implants, condoms, and pills. And so these community health fairs were given in association and collaboration with the Ministry of Health, as well as with youth serving organizations. And so through the scale up of great activities in the northern communities, to date, 44% of contraceptive methods that were provided through the APC programming have been to youth age 15 to 24, which is quite significant. We have also reached nearly 30,000 young people in these communities. Our partners have trained approximately 100 youth platform leaders to deliver the scalable toolkit and engage more than 16,000 community leaders and members in dialogue and reflection. And we hosted a total of 8 health fairs, which again allowed many attendees to receive access to contraceptive methods. And so just in terms of a quick reflection, so there are 4 reflections that we really wanted to leave you with. And so it's well recognized that programs that want to improve adolescent youth sexual and reproductive health must go beyond a focus on individual behavior change and service delivery improvement in order to address the social norms that constrict youth and people's access to sexual and reproductive health services. For APC, as a program that largely focuses on community-based service delivery, we found that the importance of community engagement really could not be overstated. It was quite important in allowing youth to have access to services which they previously did not have. Thirdly, the enabling environment that was created by having the great scale-up activities really did facilitate the success of the outreach activities that allowed us to reach a large number of youth with pregnancy prevention methods that I mentioned and services through VHT referrals and the community health fairs. And finally, the success of the Great Scale Up through the APC project confirms the relevancy of this intervention and the usefulness of the toolkit in various programmatic activities and contexts, and lets us know that it is scalable and able to be incorporated into other programs and projects. So with that, I will pass it on to Karen. Yeah.
Thank you. And this will be really quick because I know we want a lot of time for discussion. I so appreciate being here today. This has been just such a fantastic event, really, to hear about these 2 really amazing projects. As somebody said, SBC is it's not new. We've been hearing about it for a long time, but it's being adapted, as Callie said, and it's just so exciting to hear about the results. So I was asked to talk about ethical considerations and risks for externally led social change, and I guess this is really a very researchy question, because when I hear ethical and risks, I think IRB. But that's probably a good thing, and these projects were grounded in ethical considerations. Is that always the case for the I'm not trying to target social behavior change, but since we're talking about that, is that always the case? And I just think that one of the biggest challenges that we have in the ethical considerations is we're all subject to social norms. We're our own social norms. And as I think we've alluded to, all of us, is that ours are shifting in this country right now, and it's scaring people. But we all come with our own mental models, don't we, of what's appropriate and what we think the outcome should be. We want to empower women. We want to, we have a mental model. So I just wonder, are we designing these projects for our own mental model, or are we really listening to the communities and giving them what they want? And this is from programming from many years ago, social participation after ICPD, and people going to communities and saying, what do you want? What can we give you? Danielle shaking, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And people didn't come up with family planning. That wasn't what they said they wanted, but guess what? That's where the funding was from. So guess what they got? Family planning. And the reverse, this is something from Uganda, a recent RCT on using balanced scorecards for social accountability, right? I can't exactly remember the topic, but the people said, well, it's really funny. When we were talking to communities, they kept saying they wanted family planning. But that's not what the RCT is about. So we're like, oh, give us those data. We're going to analyze them, and hopefully we can get some family planning going. So I think we really just have to examine our own mental models. And I always think of, okay, we want youth, right? We want programming for youth now. That's one of the goals of FP 2020, et cetera, programming for youth. And I sit in rooms and I think, okay, programming for youth, services for youth. I'm thinking one thing, somebody else is thinking another thing, and the elephant in the room is that person married? For one person, it's like that's when they get services. For somebody else, it's like, no, whenever they go in, whatever age. So you guys were talking earlier about measuring contraceptive use in 10 to 14. That's our mental model, that they should be using contraception. That is not everybody's mental model. So I think that's one of the challenges. And I also think, do we really look at unintended consequences of these? I mean, when you're testing people's social norms, it's really, I mean, as we see in this country, it can be quite combative and threatening. So do we really pay enough attention to the unintended consequences of our activities, and and I'm actually curious, for these two projects, were there any unintended consequences that you saw and dealt with, and how did you deal with them? Because I think that's going to be important. Can't read my writing. Let's see. Again, but I just wanted to say, though, with that said, well, okay, one other thing, since I'm supposed to be talking about measurement, and I go back to our days of gender programming and looking at what's the difference of integrating gender into programming. And we had all these reproductive health outcomes that we looked at, and very few measurements of gender norm changes. So I see and I know you guys must have tons of results. Then you just had a chance to just show a few of them. But how are we really measuring social norm changes? It's got to be more than just gender norm changes, which I think is what we saw in the results today. But if you have other measurements of sort of wider gender norm changes, I think we're all really interested in how those are measured and sort of what those look like. But really, really positive results. So I think it seems like this programming, we're really on the right track. And I just wanted to say that I had the opportunity in the mid-90s to work, mid 2000s, not that old, well I am, but to work on from youth programming in Jamaica. This was an AID project, and this was with young adolescents, 10 to 14. And we had the opportunity, with funding from the Gates Foundation, to go back this year, and I keep calling them kids. They're not kids anymore. They're in their 20s, right? Transitions to adulthood. And we found a lot of them, and sort of were able to find out what difference that early programming had made, and it did make a difference. It really made a difference. So I just want to say, I think that was one of the questions asked is, should we keep working with very young adolescents? Absolutely, that's the answer. Absolutely, keep working, because that's really a foundational time to be changing these norms. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. You all presented some provocative thoughts, so thank you for making my job so easy.
Yeah.
You
I
got
did
one.
not hear religion mentioned today, and social norms. Again, our model, right? Our model, separation of church and state, right? And I just remember this. It always sticks with me. Somebody working on HIV programming who said, end of life care does not need a spiritual dimension. And I was in Africa, and I'm like, oh my, anyway. So I just wanted to add some provocation to it.
Thank you. I think I actually saw in one of the presentations that a quote that was given by one of the participants was about religion. So it was there. And it's important to note that Passages, one of the big research studies that Passages has in DRC, is working with faith-based communities, not just with faith-based communities, but with a faith-based approach. Right. So really important. So one question that came to me, Karen, while you were talking, and I really want to open this up to the audience as well, is, okay, so we have these mental models, and they're different from the communities in which we're trying to work. I think we need to acknowledge that. But how do we ensure that we acknowledge our outside mental models when we are designing interventions? What does this look like when we are designing something and we have an aha moment when we're like, wait a second, is that really how this is going to work? Or is that really what this community is, how they will think and how they will react? So I wonder if you all, the discussants, or if anybody in the audience has a good example of when that has happened. Don't be shy. Mm-hmm. Sorry, can we bring the mic to you? And if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, Lorette Kakuza, Independent. We always give lip service to stakeholder participation, but when we're designing a program, we're writing to it for a donor, and there isn't that time or space often to get that input. And I think that's something we have to look at for more donor education. And also, really make an effort to draw on, in-country staff. Oops, it stopped. Oh, there. Experience, so that we get that perspective into the design.
Yeah. Actually, can we go right here? Yeah, and then we'll go to Mahira.
Marcy Rubart, Save the Children, and also TJ. This right-hand question is one that I find very perplexing. And I'm going to push that to a little bit of a different level. Part of what I get out of this business is, by virtue of working in other cultures, I have my own assumptions and norms challenged all the time. And I find myself wondering, with some of these social change approaches, if one of the benefits or the value add isn't that I'm able to see things differently than the community, and I'm able to challenge some of the community's assumptions in a way they don't see. So I don't think that's in and of itself a bad thing, but I think the point becomes, when does that become a judgment? When does that become mine is the right way and yours is the wrong way, versus an approach to really being able to challenge people about, does my wife really work full-time even though she doesn't earn any money? That's not something men see if they're not challenged from outside. And I have countless examples of those kind of aha light bulb moments that I saw more clearly than the people I was talking with.
So that outside perspective can be
I don't know if it's possible to do it without some kind of outside perspective. Education in country often is that outside perspective. People who are more educated. But
Mahira?
Yeah, I just want to build on what both the speakers just said, Lorette and Marcy. Perfect. I completely agree with both of you, because you do need to challenge social norms everywhere, not just where we are working, but even back here. Because there are some fundamental things through the centuries we have learned. There are some basic human rights that we all agree on. And if those human rights are not there for 50% of the population, or whatever, then it is our job to challenge them. The question is, what do we do? How do we do it? And once we challenge them, what do we do with that? I mean, what solutions can we offer the communities that they themselves can actually act on? The one thing that, when it comes to donor education, that I would say is very critical is, when we talk about scale up, I think we have to start thinking about a very different kind of scale up. It's not scale up of a particular intervention which worked somewhere, but maybe the scale up of the approach that led to the intervention. I mean, it's the idea that the part that you said we don't have luxury to do, but which is the most critical thing. I mean, the idea of actually spending a critical amount of time understanding the communities you're about to work in, and then figure out, but the approaches to understand those communities are what some of these projects are all proving works. It's the approach, the social network approach, the kinds of tools, not necessarily what's in those cards, but the kinds of activities that are kind of a universal human way of learning, or universal human way of communicating. Those are the things that are replicable. What is the content can vary, based on the barriers in those particular communities. But how do you scale those up within those communities? Because community is a huge difference, and the barriers may be different. So those are the kinds of things I think making donors understand that, and building into proposals the fact that it is critical to have this initial period, even whether it doesn't have to be a research project, a service delivery project needs to understand this, and it's never built in to those. And that's what I think we need to keep educating people about.
I think I see one more hand.
Hello, this is Jane from iPass. I'm grateful for this opportunity for this social norms discussion today. We are moving on doing more on community and social norms work in sync with our health systems work, which I think is a real organisational move for us. But one thing, when you were talking, Murray Stopes, I don't think anyone from Murray Stopes is here today. I don't want to talk on their behalf, but they've also done with Packard a really large human-centered design type program in Tanzania and in Zambia, and they're scaling that up. And they recently, maybe 6 months ago, did a really great presentations of the lessons learnt. And I was just wondering, amongst all the different folks doing contraception and SRHR and abortion work, what other spaces are there for us to collaborate on what is really difficult organisationally, building in and changing the way we work, both in the health system, in M&E, in the way we work in North Carolina or Washington, D.C., as well as in our country offices.
Okay, so some provocative thoughts. One, Mihira, I'm right there with you. Human rights, I always think in these terms. We certainly have examples, though, of pushback, right? Of, you're the external actor. Who are you to tell us how to behave? And so, I know about those things, through grad school, but I'm sure you all have some examples of a time when a community or maybe a ministry of health has pushed back on external intervention and how we dealt with that. So I wonder if anybody has an example of a way that, or maybe you prevented it in the first place and it never happened. But some concrete examples of times when, we have struggled with this and we've had to work through it. I see a hand. I don't know where the other, oh yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, so many examples. I think the one thing that we need to keep in mind is the people at the Ministry of Health, generally the staff and local projects are from the elite. And they have their own conceptions of what, say, villagers or urban slum residents are. And sometimes I talk to them about being a member of the elite and what that means. And what I do, as they push back a lot, is to teach them how to do some qualitative research and take them into the villages or the slums. And we do, well, this is for communication, so it's a little easier, but even if it weren't, for formative research. And they ask the questions, and that someone asked me after 30 some odd years in development, did I ever feel like I accomplished anything? And I said, you know what I've done? I've brought a lot of elite members who have some power in lots of developing countries. And I've brought them to the villages and the slums, and they've come back saying, wow, these are real people, and they have problems like we do, and they kind of know what they're doing. And that's, I think, the best I can hope for in development anyway.
So I can give two examples from the GREAT project, and this isn't examples of us as the HU staff. These are our Ugandan staff leading the project. So the first was during the design phase. Thank you, Callie, for reminding me of this. But during the design phase, and we strategically chose to engage three ministries: the health, education, and gender. Well, Melissa, right? Social. What is it? What's that one? Yeah, gender, social affairs. It's everything. Yeah. So, I mean, our project was happening, at least with the younger adolescents, on school grounds, but not necessarily within the curriculum and in the classroom. But we thought, let's bring in education. Obviously health, because it's health content, it's linking to health services, and definitely the social affairs, because all this was happening in the community, really, and that's where this would sit, with the least powerful ministry at the table. But we used our convening power to bring them together and to get some endorsement of the materials. Yeah, and this is a struggle, and it's an art in how you do this and how you negotiate. And they have to, you know, the ministers send their junior staffers, they keep their cards tight, and they have their own personal views, but then they're representing the views of the people above them. In the end, through all the discomfort of some of what was in our materials, the final compromise and solution was removing 2 images, and they're the ones of the naked bodies. And this is part of being rigid and sticking your ground, or do we take that out and allow how many adolescents have access to information that's still going to be beneficial for them? And so we did that. In this case, we actually had some printed already, so we had to glue pages together. But in future iterations, you know. But then comes the latter part of our project, which is this past year, where there was a bubbling up of parents in mostly the Kampala area. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the comprehensive sexuality education ban, that the government said we are stopping all CSE in this country. And this came from a group of parents that really ballooned fast, that were in very strong opposition to sexuality education. And one good thing was we never called grades comprehensive sexuality education, yet the content is directly linked to the UNESCO international standards. But we never called it that. And we had multi-ministry approval, and somehow we weren't a target, or the project and the materials weren't a target of this bubbling up. And they did point out individuals, organizations, and materials in their advocacy efforts. So anyway, we continued with great. We were never cited to stop, and our staff, there were some concerns on an organizational level. But coming out of this, the ban will be lifted. There's a whole thing going on. And I think what will happen maybe next year is that these materials and tools will end up being the solution to what they need and what comes out of this and what is appropriate and can be used maybe within classrooms and communities, because we've had that engagement from the beginning.
Yeah, something to think about, because you've all been doing this and have been thinking about it. Yes, it will be strange coming from me, but governments are not anywhere a reflection of their people necessarily. At least I hope to God they're not. In our case, they are the elite. So when the more we can, the world is different today, and communities in general are more reachable and can become far more independent of governments than they could in the past. So given the whole nature of communication and the way information and ideas travel today around the world, I think we have to start thinking of different ways of also reaching people, especially the young. And talking about tipping points and all that, and what it takes to change and sustain change within communities depends so much on the group the specific target group, the specific idea, and the specific mode of the intervention. For example, in a high school, 5 kids could change their shoes, and next day the entire bunch would change their shoes to that, because it's what is the catchy thing and what catches their eye. Whereas for the same way, for in a community, sometimes you'll have to change the minds of 70% of the people before something will stick. So things like that. But it's the way, I think we have to look for different channels and different ways of engaging communities and engaging people, rather than
in addition to what we have been doing, which is going community by community and generating the kind of community change that we're looking for. So I don't know, I'm more hopeful that, especially with young people, yes, they are the biggest challenge, but they're also maybe the easiest group to reach in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Danielle Grant with Plan, and I was part of the TJ team. I think another way of looking at this, and I think it follows up with Mahir, and this is, starting little, but I think we saw that transformation with the team. We were working with our counterparts that were working at the community level, both care and plan. And one of the things that we found as our team was we had to start with our own staff to walk the walk. And we had challenges. I mean, we were dealing in a country where unmet need was high, family planning wasn't discussed. Men made the decision around family planning for the family, and that was instilled in our own team. And so, we realized that we had to start working with them, not telling them what to do, but for them themselves to do reflections, for them to sort of look at the changes in social norms, in decision-making within the household, in acceptance of family planning and family size. And we did that through a number of activities, even our materials. And so over the years, we found that our own team, that were the ones that were actually working with the partners and for the implementation, were transformed themselves. And that was a huge leap because it was also those individuals that influenced the community. And when we're talking about unintended consequences, there were circumstances where we had a couple of situations where within the village where a woman would go access services and her husband kicked her out of the house. And so there was a huge commotion in one of the villages about this, that she was kicked out of the house. And it was one of our staff who was well respected within the community, that worked within the community, that was transformed, that was able to do the negotiation, discussing this with the husband. So, it's small scale, but I think we saw a difference. And we also would ask our team members, so do you see a difference for your children? And there was already sort of talk about the boys and the girls would be treated equally, the change in the chores in the household. So it was just sort of a snowball effect. So it was something that was good for us to see.
Can I add 2 sentences to that? As I've been working with a similar project more recently in Nepal, as I think about it, it isn't just the reflective activities we did with our staff. It's that whole educational process, that it isn't until you teach something that you actually learn it. And so it wasn't until our staff, having been through the reflective process themselves, were also asked to backstop and support that process in the community with catalyzers or with influential people, that they really bought in to their own change.
Mm-hmm. Great. So it seems like the lesson learned there is you have to walk the walk, and you have to do that with your staff first. That's really important. That's a good reflection. Another question that came to me is, okay, so ministries of health might not be representative of the people that we're trying to serve. I wonder about youth engagement, right? So great, certainly engaged adolescents, and youth engagement is something that, we, the donors, but, now the we're all talking about it. And, something that I learned along the way is it's a struggle to get youth that actually represent the people that you're trying to serve. How have you all adapted, and maybe the discussants have some thoughts, but how have you all adapted with that to get around tokenism, right? We don't want just to be able to say, well, oh yeah, we're engaging the youth, but not all youth are created equal, of course. So I wonder if anybody has some experience, working around that or struggling with it. Yeah.
So I can speak to that a little bit. In our experience in implementing the health fairs, one of the things that we noticed in one of the districts is that I think the health fairs would run from about 12 to 8 p.m. And we noticed that most of the youth would show up at about 6 p.m. And so we said, okay, well, it seems like the youth like to come out a little bit later. And so one of the ideas, one of the ideas we were toying with is having the health fair start later to try to capture more of the youth that would want to come out later. So, I mean, that's something that would be like fall into the category of trying to like optimize and have more youth friendly services. And so we think by doing that, we would get a more representative, probably representation of youth who would want to access those services. So try to adapt the services as much as we can.
Do you know if you did?
So we didn't actually do it yet. Yeah, but that's okay. So we're still in the process of tweaking the program. Yeah, but that was one of the things that we did notice throughout.
Callie?
Hi, Callie, starting with Pathfinder, and I just want to reflect for a minute on your question or comment around youth participation. And I think we should, as this discussion continues amongst all of us, I think we need to get better at being very specific about what we mean when we talk about youth participation, not only which youth, which I think is a critical question, but then at what moment in the project are we intending to engage them and how, and what is the goal we're seeking to achieve. And so, for example, I hope I don't speak out of turn. My great colleagues can remind me. So the whole year of formative research obviously involved a lot of adolescents as subjects of the formative research, and the methods were very participatory. But the project design was not done with adolescents. I mean, it was done using their insights, their information, which was gathered in a very participatory way, but it was done with a bunch of adults in the room from Uganda and the US, and it was participatory in a different way. And then youth were heavily involved, of course, in implementing GREAT. They were both the receivers of GREAT and, in many cases, the leaders of the activities of GREAT. But they, for example, were not then like the evaluators of GREAT. So I think it's, we talk often about youth participation in design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We also have a parallel stream of discussion on youth leadership and creating and fostering youth leaders. And so all of those things are important, can be extremely valuable, but it's important to be specific, I think, in what we did, what value that had, what else could we have done differently, and why. And for what purpose and to what end, and but just be really thoughtful about that. And we're trying to do that better in our programs. Be very explicit from the beginning. Where are we involving youth? For what purpose? Which youth? How? Where are we not? And we're making a very intentional design choice around that for various reasons and why. And I think the more we can do that, and the more we can be specific in that discussion, the better we'll get at understanding how to do it with which youth and when, etc. So just a reflection I've been having recently, and Brad wants to talk. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a couple more minutes. I did want to probe on that a little bit more, and maybe Brad can speak to this. Well, the probe is, should youth have been in the room when you were actually designing the interventions or evaluating?
No, I would say no. I think that's tokenism. They would feel, going back to what that room was like and what it was like, they would feel so out of place unless we worked with them for 2 months to lead up to that moment, which you could do if that's your purpose. So I heard Kelly say very similar comment at the Young Lives conference in Oxford, and you're onto something, you're consistent, but I really think, people should sit with Kelly and unpack this, because it is, I've been doing ASRH for 17 years now, 12 years at Save the Children. I still struggle with this because we still say youth engagement in everything you just said, in the design, implementation, evaluation. It's too broad of a statement. And I think Kelly has it right. It's about youth engagement for what purpose at what time, and it has to be unpacked like that. So I've always struggled with how to do it properly, but what I've loved about partnership with IRH and implementation science is that the fact that there's such a heavy research focus that's qualitative in nature, that does formative research for a year with ethnographers, does a cohort study with 40 young people. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything that was more engaging of youth and youth voices in everything we've done because of the research aspects.
Yeah, hang on, let me pass the mic because we want people to hear.
Obviously, we argued about this for 6 years. So, but one piece of it was also when the intervention was designed, there was a very intensive field testing process. So Save the Children and Pathfinder took the pieces of the intervention to the field with kids. They tested them, they asked them their opinion. Do you like it? Do you not like it? So that was our kind of compromise. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you should do it anyway, but that was how we engaged them. So I think we're almost.
We are out of time.
Do you wanna close
Yeah,
it?
so thank you to Sheena and Karen, and thank you for your active participation.
Thank you. You are very impressive. We're sticking to time. So we now have a 15-minute break.